Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I am one of your hosts today. I am John Dehlin. We are super happy to have you all joining us on the live stream. And we are here gratefully to have back in our studio with us the one, the only, the myth, the legend, Sandra Tanner. Welcome back to Mormon Stories, Sandra.
Yes, good to be here.
Thanks for joining us.
Yes, hope I can just remember some of what I've read through the years.
Well, we're here to talk about early Mormons and Joseph Smith's polygamy. This is kind of part 2 of our series, and we're trying to cover Doctrine and Covenants section 132. And I don't think we're going to make it through it all, but we're gonna at least cover part 2, and I think there's going to be part 3. We are joined, of course, by our dear beloved friend and co-host Gerardo Sumano. Hey, Gerardo.
Hi, John.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, excited.
Thanks
Thanks
for preparing this and making it happen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no problem.
And we are wishing Kara Burrell our best as she engages in a much needed vacation. So Kara's out this week, and in Kara's place, we have the newest member of the Open Stories Foundation family, Jen Camp. Hey, Jen.
Hi, everyone.
Thanks for joining us.
You're so welcome. It's fun to be here.
It's good to have you back.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so we covered in part 1 the first half of a podcast with Hank Smith, John By the Way, and who, Gerardo? You want to give us the background of the podcast that we're kind of that we're going to be reviewing today?
Yeah, so the podcast is called Follow Him, and what they're doing is basically every week, or at least a couple times a month, they released an episode just covering the materials on the Come Follow Me program. And this is from last year, because last year the church was studying Doctrine and Covenants on Sunday school, and it just happened that someone sent me the link to the podcast of Hank Smith and John By the Way for Doctrine and Covenants 132, and I was kind of interested in it because Kate Halbrook, who is a church historian, she works for the church and so she was in it, and they just discussed polygamy. They discussed how Joseph Smith practiced it and a lot of the context around it, but they also left a lot of the context out, which is why we're doing basically playing some of the stuff they were saying and then responding to it and making our own comments.
Yeah. So we responded to part 1 of their two-parter on D&C 132, and today we're gonna cover part 2 that we thought would cover the rest of the Doctrine and Covenants. It turns out that's not true, right, Sandra?
No, they stopped short of some of the most intriguing part.
Yeah. So that's why we're gonna have to have a part 3. All right. So I guess we'll dig in, and so where we left off, what we're going to do is we're just going to be playing clips. Gerardo?
Sorry, is that just a comment from Dan Hardy, who is he's always well, not always, but he listens frequently. He said those guys are pretty amazing. So, like, talking about Hank Smith and John By the Way, such strength for the youth. Love that my daughter is taking Hank's class at BYU this semester. Actually, I have a friend who's also taking a class by Hank Smith, and she's not very happy about it.
But Dan's basically saying Dan's a faithful member,
Yeah.
and we're really glad that Dan is joining us in the comments.
Yeah,
because we don't want to be an echo chamber, and we actually want, like Sandra, you even were kind of setting the tone. We want to be respectful and not be angry, not be sarcastic, not be cynical. It's kind of hard, but I just want to say, Dan Hardy, we're glad you're here. Any of you who are believers or Orthodox Mormons, we're glad you're here. We want your comments. We don't want you to feel unwelcome or disrespected. So thanks, Dan. Glad to know that your daughter is enjoying Hank Smith's class at BYU.
Yeah.
And what we'll appreciate, Dan, is your comments and others from what's said by Dan and John By the Way
Definitely.
today.
And our responses.
Yeah.
What does he think about it?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I think we should probably jump in. Should we jump in?
Yep.
Okay. So let's begin with part 2. I'll switch over to the video and we'll hear the first clip. And this is Kate Holbrook on the Follow Him podcast.
And read them. And that information about to raise up a righteous seed, we have allowed that in our imaginations to give us inaccurate understandings. I don't know about you when you were on your missions. When I was on my mission, I taught what my trainer had taught me, and it's incorrect. And it was to say that the reason we had plural marriage in Utah is because there were more women than men. And so in order for all of those women to be able to be married, there had to be plural marriage. And that's not true. That's incorrect. There were more men than there were women. But the thing that is correct is there were more righteous women than there were men. There were more women who took the restored gospel very seriously, and church participation and obedience and all that very seriously. So for a woman who wanted that kind of a relationship, her choices were more narrow.
Okay.
I'm not saying that explains plural marriage,
Right.
but we also see that the descendants of those plural marriages, hardly any, if any, I'm trying to remember descendants of plural marriages that took place in Nauvoo, but there are definitely a lot of descendants that resulted from plural marriages in Utah. I'm one of them. And among them have been church leaders for decades, for generations. So it did produce a righteous seed.
Okay, so I apologize. I should have probably acknowledged that they were starting D&C 132, verse 30. And we're going to go along with the few verses that they do cover, because they do cover about 6 or 7 verses in this part 2. And what they were referring to was Doctrine and Covenants. So pull out your scriptures, Mormon Stories listeners, pull out your quads, turn to Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, verse 30, because that's what they were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go ahead and read it. It says, quote, Abraham received promises concerning his seed. And Sandra, what do you think Joseph Smith means when he says seed?
Well, I believe he is meaning posterity.
Yeah.
But Abraham's promise was that he would be through his seed, he'd be a blessing to all nations. And so I see that as a foreshadowing of blessing the world through his descendant Christ, whereas Joseph sees it as this eternal procreation of millions of children for all eternity.
Right. And when I think of the word seed, I not to be crude, it's an anatomical body part. I think of sperm when I read the word seed. So again, Joseph writes, Abraham received promises concerning his seed or sperm, and of the fruit of his loins, which I think you're right, Sandra, that's posterity, right? According to Joseph Smith, from whose loins ye are, namely my servant Joseph. So he's basically saying Joseph is a descendant of Abraham,
Right.
like a literal blood descendant of Abraham.
Right. Literally through Abraham down through Christ.
So somehow Joseph is Jewish and Anglo-Saxon or Caucasian at the same time. I don't know how that works. Anyway, verse 30 goes on, which were to continue so long as they were in the world, and as touching Abraham and his seed, out of the world they should continue, both in the world and out of the world, should they continue as innumerable as the stars, or if you were to count the sand upon the seashores, ye could not number them. So Sandra, you're basically saying Joseph Smith is talking about eternal increase and gazillions of spirit children as Joseph Smith becomes a God like our current Heavenly Father, that sort of thing.
Right. And this would also seem to be an endorsement of continuing polygamy in heaven, because if all of Abraham's plural wives and everyone past him that had plural wives are having all this seed, then it seems to be putting that as the norm rather than just one man, one woman. It seems to be putting the stamp on large posterity that would be accomplished through more than one wife.
Right. What do you guys make? And Gerardo and Jen, I want to bring you in if you want to. Is they basically are making this point that all of us were taught at some point that there were more righteous women. There were more women than men.
Yeah, and that's
in
incorrect.
Utah, and that's why we had to do polygamy, and more women than men.
Yeah. Well, she's off to a good start because she starts by saying this idea that she taught on her mission, right? That there was more women than men in Utah, and that's why polygamy had to be lived. So, and she acknowledges that that's actually wrong, and that
Right.
now that she's a historian, realizes that that's wrong.
That's good. She's being honest.
Right,
there.
right.
Yeah.
So we're off to a really good start. And then she brings up the fact that, well, but actually, what it's actually true, she says, is that there was more righteous women than righteous men. So the righteous women needed righteous husbands, but there were not enough righteous husbands. But she does say that that's in and of itself, it's not a reason. It's not the reason or a reason for why polygamy was instituted.
And I don't know why she brought it up.
Right, exactly.
But in actual fact, it's the same condition today. They have more righteous women in their churches
Right.
than righteous men. So why wouldn't God have them do the same program now?
Right.
So what's wrong with that, Sandra? I mean, God wants everyone to be in the celestial kingdom with Him, and everybody's got to have the celestial marriage. And so it's just a matter of math, Sandra, that there's
Yeah.
got to be polygamy so that women will have men to be sealed to.
Well, if that were truly what God said, yes, I don't believe that God instituted polygamy or that it ever was God ordained. It was just a cultural system of Abraham's day. It wasn't something God instituted.
Does the Bible say that God commanded Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to practice polygamy?
No, there's nothing to indicate that. And they always want to talk about Sarah and her obeying and giving Abraham her concubine. But they make it out as though God commanded this in the book of Abraham. But the Bible says that it was all Sarah's idea. She
Right.
made this big mess by her jumping ahead of God's promise instead of waiting for God to do a miracle for her to conceive. She was the one that takes charge and says, oh, well, you could take Hagar and get a child that way. And in that day, that would have been an acceptable custom. But they want to make it out that God commanded that as part of a doctrine. And the scriptures just won't back that up.
Right. What about the argument they're making that lots of Mormon leaders came from polygamy? So it must be a good thing because a lot of the past Mormon leaders came from polygamous families. And by the way, isn't Jacob say in the Book of Mormon, Jacob 1, whatever, Jacob says, no polygamy, except I need to raise up a righteous seed.
Right.
Right.
So what's wrong with that argument?
Well, I came from that righteous seed. And maybe there's truth in that.
Anyone else want to comment on that?
I mean, that's their belief. But if you want to do a counter argument, also a lot of non-righteous seed has come out from it. So
Yes.
like Sandra.
So-
Like
and me. By the way, I'm a descendant of polygamy.
right.
So I don't know. I think I'm righteous. Do you think I'm righteous, Gerardo?
And
He
then
didn't answer. He didn't answer.
it's hard to answer, John. By whose standards?
By yours.
By my standards, you are.
Thanks.
Righteous.
Thanks, buddy.
But so then there's that, and then there's also the fact that you're in Utah, everyone's Mormon, people are practicing polygamy, like you're already programmed since you're born that this is the religion you need to follow, even, we know about the women who were recruited in England to come to join the church, and then, oh, guess what? There's polygamy here. But then they wouldn't have the money to leave. So kind of saying, like, oh, it's such a miracle that righteous seed was produced out of this practice in Utah. It's kind of like, I mean, it's obvious that was going to happen, right? That there was going to be leaders coming out of that, of the state.
Well,
'Cause it-
that's the same today. We still have leaders coming out of that same pool.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a testimony of the truthfulness of polygamy, or it could be a testimony that Mormon leaders call other leaders who are in their families,
Oh, yeah, that's true.
or who are their buddies or their cronies. And if they're giving multiple wives to their buddies,
Mhm.
then they're going to maybe give leadership positions to the children of their
Right.
buddies. And so it's more of a testament to cronyism, to favoritism, to what's it called when when you make your son a prophet? You're a prophet, you make your son a prophet. Nemo talks about this in a recent
I
episode.
can't remember the word.
Anyway, kind of favoritism or patronage, that sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
But see, the same thing could be pointed out in all the states back east where no one practiced polygamy, and you could find all sorts of righteous descendants of people in those states. So it's an argument that
Oh,
Only-
yeah, keep going.
nepotism, yeah, it
Nepotism,
only
yeah.
works out in that kind of setting. But I mean, it means nothing for the polygamous Mormons to have wonderful leaders coming out of that stream of families, because any state has their great leaders of that state who probably have a whole bunch of kids descending down from them that also went on to serve their city, state, country, whatever.
And we've had about 50 of our viewers write nepotism down in the comments.
Oh, well,
Thank
thank you.
I did.
Thank you, viewers. We have the best commenters in live stream, the world of live stream. Yeah, nepotism. So maybe polygamy is a testimony of God's truth and ability to prophesy, or maybe it's a testimony of nepotism.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So the next verses that they're going to be covering are verses 34 and 35 of D&C 132. I'm going to go ahead and read them. Is that all right? And then we'll
Mhm.
play the clip. So 34 says, God commanded Abraham, and Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to wife. So that's going to be important. Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to wife. And why did she do it? Because this was the law. And from Hagar sprang many people. This, therefore, was fulfilling, among other things, the promises. Then 35, was Abraham therefore under condemnation? Verily I say unto you, nay, for I, the Lord, commanded it. So those are verses 34 and 35. Now we hear them discussing verses 34 and 35.
He starts out by coming back to Abraham,
Yes.
right?
I'm glad you noticed. Yes. And these verses, I think, teach us important things about the practice of plural marriage, which God wanted at this particular time. And one is Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to wife.
Yeah.
So God commanded Abraham, and Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to wife. Oh, I wish I could ask our listeners what they make of that.
Yeah.
What I think is Sarah had agency here,
Mhm.
right?
There was consent from.
She might not have a ton of agency, but she gave her consent. And I think Jesus is setting this up as a model here, that a first wife gives consent to other marriages. And the way this played out in Nauvoo was more complicated. This didn't always happen. Nauvoo plural marriage is very different than Utah marriage, plural marriage. In Nauvoo, they were trying to figure it out. They knew there would be a lot of social opposition. They knew it could wound a lot of their loved ones, and they were keeping it secret as they tried to figure it out, but the secrecy was really wounding too. So this part of it was sometimes, but not always fulfilled in Nauvoo, and including in Joseph and Emma's own marriage.
Really
Okay.
good point.
In Utah, it was more often there's still, fallen people. There were still people who didn't obtain the consent of their first wives to take on more wives, but the rule, they were supposed to.
Well, it's important here that God was involved, Sarah was involved,
Yes.
and that's why he says they were not under condemnation, for I, the Lord, commanded it.
Great point. That's essential. That's essential for this to be okay.
So I have to know, is this the first time in the history of Mormon curriculum that the word consent has been used and is being discussed? So Jen, in all your days as a Mormon, did you ever hear a discussion about consent in Sunday school or Relief Society?
No, I did not. I did not hear. There's a lot of things that have already been said that I have never heard.
Yeah,
So
yeah. But I mean, I guess we could say it's good that they're talking about consent,
Yeah.
right?
yeah, I hope that they will use that more.
They do. They actually do. But what do you guys think about the idea that Sarah gave her consent?
Yeah.
Like they think that's really important that Sarah
Well, and
gave
that
her
God
consent.
commanded, right? Well, they keep bringing that up, and I think it's very explicit on the scripture. But Sandra already told us that God
Yeah.
didn't have anything to do with that.
But when we hear all this talk of consent, I didn't hear Hagar's name mentioned anywhere in that.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, she's just like
servant.
like your dog in the front room on the rug or something. Oh yeah, let me give you my dog. I mean, sure. So here's Sarah. She's the great one obeying God. She's going to give a human being to her husband to raise up seed, and nowhere does anyone say anything about Hagar. What did she want? I mean, the lady on the video says, "Oh, I'd like to ask the people listening to this just what they think of this." And I said, you probably wouldn't want to know what we're all thinking, because it's
Yeah,
so insulting
exactly.
to this woman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. And it's insulting when they keep commenting, yeah, Sarah, had to give her to her husband. And, this is the rule. This is what they're supposed to follow.
Mhm.
And then you read the stories of polygamy, and that rule was not followed. Like
Yeah.
there
Right.
was no rule. It was if there was a rule, it was broken again and again and again and
Yeah.
again.
Well, I think this comes up. I believe it's in the Reed Smoot hearings that they talk to different women about polygamy. And this one lady was questioned, and she said, well, polygamy worked best if you didn't love your husband very much, because then you had a more amicable relationship. But if too much love came into it, it just caused jealousies and contentions. And you take Brigham Young and different ones, they don't list all their wives. I don't think that he's asking all his wives for consent. Do you only have to ask the first? I mean, the rest don't matter what they think about it. I mean, I'm not sure just how all that works.
That's a great point. Do the second and third wives get to consult on
Yeah.
the fourth wife or just the first?
Well, and it's sorry.
Yeah.
No, go ahead.
It's really bothering me that she's bringing this point about consent over and over again, because she knows the history and she knows how it really played out, and she knows that it was, in most cases, it was not followed. I mean, Emma didn't give consent of the first 20 wives, most likely. And then even how it played out with other women that were asked to live polygamy that were close to Joseph. Like, we're going to be talking about Helen Mar Kimball in a bit, but when Helen Mar Kimball's father, Heber C. Kimball, he was asked by Joseph to practice polygamy, and so Heber goes to his wife and tells her about it, and I mean, her wife took it pretty badly, but she finally, the story goes like they went and prayed and fasted for like 3 days, and then finally Heber goes to Joseph and says, okay, yeah, my wife said, yeah, we can go ahead and do it. and I want and my wife wants me to marry these two older ladies, and then Joseph goes and says, "Oh no, actually, I want you to marry this younger woman over here who has a kid and who just came from Europe." So it's like she knows all these stories, but she keeps bringing up the consent part, and she knows. I mean, she acknowledges that it didn't play like, but I don't know. It just seems really kind of like double speak. To me, it would be more honest to say, yeah, this is talking about consent, but it actually most most of the time never played out that way.
Yeah, she kind of gives this vague reference that it was more complicated in Nauvoo.
Yeah.
What she doesn't say explicitly is that Joseph, the receiver of this revelation, he himself violated it 20 plus times before he ever actually bothered to check in with Emma if she'd be okay
Right.
with him marrying extra wives.
Right.
But she doesn't call Joseph out by name. She just kind of keeps it vague that, oh, in Nauvoo, it was a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
And with Helen Kimball, that there's so many layers to that story that
Yeah.
I hope we can get in maybe a little bit later when they start talking about her again, because I've pulled up many quotes from her journal that are from her hand,
Yeah.
and I don't believe there was any consent there.
Now, the Partridge sisters, aren't they the ones that he married twice? Okay, so you have these two teenage young girls staying in the home, and Joseph's been going to them secretly behind Emma's back and behind each of the sisters' backs, trying to convert them into polygamy. They each marry Joseph secretly. They don't even know at the time that the other one has married Joseph. And then in the meantime, Joseph's trying to get Emma to buy onto polygamy. When she finally consents, it's that she gets to pick the girls. And he says, okay, who do you pick? And she says, well, the Partridge girls staying here, they're so sweet. That'd be good. So you can marry them. Well, then Joseph's got this problem of he's already married them. So he decides, well, we'll just have a second wedding and not tell her. And we'll seal you guys all over again. And then it says that from that moment on, Emma became hostile to these girls, to the point finally she gets Joseph to tell them they have to move out. But that certainly was not a case of asking her consent. He didn't even ask the girls their consent for each other. It was all done behind the scenes.
Yeah. Finally, I just want to drive home the point that Sandra mentioned, that because while I was growing up in the church, and I think every one of us, like, we are really so meshed into the idea that God commanded the prophets in the Bible to practice polygamy. And when we even think about the story of David and how he, later sinned and took someone that was not given by God and all that, like, if you actually go and read the Bible, there's nothing that says that God commanded them to take multiple wives. And so when you take that point out of, the Mormon rhetoric, all you're left out is with Joseph is the one, like, he's the one inventing all this or coming up with all this stuff. And I don't know, to me, that's really important. It was really important for me when I first learned that there was nothing on the Bible that says that God was involved in any way with polygamy.
Right.
And that's kind of what Joseph Smith is doing here in in this verse. He's basically saying, was Abraham under condemnation? No, because God commanded it.
Yeah.
So that leads, so many people ask, why do Mormons stop believing in God and Jesus? Because the Mormon God can really be a jerk. And basically the Mormon God gets blamed for what likely was Joseph Smith's sexual predation. And if it's God sending an angel with a flaming sword, which we'll talk about later, to force Joseph Smith to practice polygamy with a teenage girl or whatever, what kind of God is that?
Yeah.
Doesn't sound like consent.
Whatever it is, it's not consent. And I really want to like Kate Holbrook, and she's a lovely, sincere woman. But when she just describes the Nauvoo period as more complicated, that they were just trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
What's there to figure out?
Right.
Like, it's here in the Revelation. follow the revelation.
Yeah.
But the problem is Joseph had already married 22 women before the revelation came or whatever. And
Yeah.
so it's not that they were trying to figure it out. It's that Joseph would, I mean, maybe a more plausible explanation is Joseph came up with the revelation afterwards to justify the behavior that he was doing before.
Yeah, which actually Hallberg kind of says that later.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Okay. All right. So let's continue. And I'm going to go ahead and read verse 36 because I think they're about to talk about the Abrahamic test next. So D&C 132, verse 6, Abraham was commanded to offer his son Isaac. Nevertheless, it was written, thou shalt not kill. Abraham, however, did not refuse, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness. All right, let's hear what they have to say as they discuss this.
Abraham was commanded to offer his son Isaac. Nevertheless, it was written, thou shalt not kill. Abraham, however, did not refuse, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness.
I like that the Lord is bringing up this Abrahamic test, as we've come to call it, because I feel like plural marriage is kind of an Abrahamic test for the whole church, and even for us today. Even for us today, trying to make sense of this is kind of an Abrahamic test for some of us.
Yes, absolutely. And a lot of the people who were alive during the time when this practice was part of the church, they referred to it this way as an
the
Abrahamic test.
Abrahamic test.
Mhm. And why an Abrahamic test? Because it was as painful as having to offer up your son as a sacrifice. It was, I mean, this was painful. All of the ideals that they had of romantic marriage, of the intimacy of marriage between two people instead of marriage among 5 people or more, they had to give up all of those ideals, which were really, really valued and prevalent in society at that time. You know, even more so than now. Now we have a lot of other
Right.
visions of marriage than they did back then. So this was tough. This was a big ask.
Kate, I don't know if you're going to bring this up later. I don't want to steal it from you, but if I remember right, when Joseph introduces this principle to Brigham says, it's the first time I desired the grave.
He saw a
I
funeral
envied-
and he envied the corpse that he saw in the funeral.
Yeah, he said, I'd rather
Yes.
die than live this.
Yes.
Right. I hope I didn't steal that from you, but I imagine
No.
everybody felt that way.
I think that what I read is nobody liked it. Hiram, Joseph's own brother, just resisted for years.
And
You know,
Oliver
for a couple of
Cowdery
years there.
Pretty upset with
Mhm.
Joseph. And
Hmm. And then imagine, the women who heard about this, because usually because they were invited to be sealed to Joseph Smith, they hated it too. But we're on the foundation of God's love and grace here in this section, and God did. He answered prayers, and not every woman said yes. And those women who said yes, they had spiritual experiences, deep ones, profound ones, letting them know that this was God's will. So they didn't have to go into this blind.
most women would have to have something pretty powerful, and so agency consent still operative here is what you're saying.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh man, there's so much there. So
there's so much.
you guys were laughing. I want to cover it all. First of all, I want to do a poll. By the way, did Isaac consent to being sacrificed by his dad? Or anyway, okay, Sandra, which would be harder for you, to take on an extra spouse or to kill your own child? Sandra, you go first. Kill your own child, take on an extra spouse.
Well, I'd probably take the spouse over killing my child.
Right. Gerardo, taking an extra spouse or killing your child, which is harder?
Taking another spouse.
Jen, killing a child or taking on an extra spouse?
I would take on an extra spouse.
So Kate Holbrook wanted to say that it's equal. It's like,
Yeah.
kill your child, take on an extra, and then they just go on. And you guys were totally laughing that like Brigham was
Hiram.
just Hiram and Brigham. Jen, why were you laughing about the Brigham was just tortured to take on
Yeah.
50 wives? Why?
That's just ridiculous. Like, okay. I could maybe think that when he initially first heard it, that could be possibly a reaction. But I think he got over it pretty fast, is all I'm saying.
Why is it? Why?
Because he had like 50 plus wives. And like,
Well, even during this time, he's
Like-
pulling women, you know, like when the revelation was written, like Brigham is cornering women in rooms and locking the door and proposing them to be married to him. And
And we're actually telling you, Sandra, an actual descendant of Brigham Young, what Brigham Young was like. Do you,
Yeah.
do you want to get in here?
Yes, well, you're bringing up the Martha Brotherton
Yeah.
case where you have this single woman who's invited up to the office room upstairs in the red brick store, which it's reported had a sign above it, positively no admittance. And you would be invited into this room, and Martha's locked in. And Brigham talks to her about polygamy, and she still can't believe this is true. So he brings in Joseph to convince her it's really true. And she is quite startled by this whole thing, doesn't know what to do. And she's very quick thinking, because then she says, well, I'll have to go home and pray about this. And so she's able to get them to unlock the door and let her go home. And as I recall, she flees the city rather than face all this. And then the Mormons demonize her
yeah,
as this liar and horrible person that she would spread these terrible rumors. So in the video, they talk about
and what's funny is that Brigham later seals to her once she
Yeah.
dies, right?
yeah, she later sealed.
himself to her. No consent there.
No, so the whole thing becomes so muddled in what it means to give consent. Um, how is it working when half the time Brigham and Joseph aren't asking their real wives consent? They're just doing this behind their back. We have no knowledge that Brigham's wife, Mary Ann Angel, was asked about any of this, but he keeps racking up the numbers.
Yeah. And I think something that probably I was just thinking about right now, like the reason why Brigham and Joseph and William and all this Heber and all of them were really trying to get the consent or convince the women that polygamy was something from God was so the women wouldn't talk about it and keep it secret, not because they were really like, if they had a choice, I bet, well, probably they wouldn't be getting their consent. They would just be doing it.
Right. And you have to define consent of which woman.
Right.
That woman's consent or the wife's consent.
Right. Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Going back to Hagar, by the way, it turns out Hagar was a slave. So you mentioned that they're treating her like a dog.
Yeah.
She was a literal
right.
slave, and somehow God didn't stop in the Old Testament to go, hey, stop having slaves. It's just like,
Yeah. Well, it's again a part of their culture.
yeah. Okay. So, and then they wanted to talk about romantic values and how tough it was.
They mentioned Oliver Cowdery and how mad he was when he found out. Well, in reality, when Oliver Cowdery finds out, there's no polygamy doctrine around, like
Right.
at all. Like it's not being developed, and every contemporary source that talks about Fanny Alger talks about it as an affair.
Yes, it's 1834, 35. This is
Yeah, she will say
anything.
Yeah, she'll say actually, Kate Halberg will say 1833,
Yeah.
which
Yes.
is way early. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Oliver thought of it as a dirty, nasty, filthy affair,
Right.
which would have been correct according to the Mormon doctrine of the day. He would have been in line with what the Mormons considered scripture.
Yeah.
Joseph would have been the one out of line.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I just have to say, I would never compare something to an Abrahamic test as a good thing. To me, I'm not a fan of the story. I think I
Yeah.
want to think it was just like maybe some cultural thing, but like, can you imagine hauling your child up to a rock, putting him on a rock and lifting a knife as you're about to stab your child, what that would literally do. It's okay if it's a myth, if it's a story, but I would never favorably compare something to that story of Abraham. You're nodding your head, Jen.
Yeah, I don't even think it's a good story.
Yeah.
If it was just a like common day story. Yeah, it's just I like as a parent, that's unthinkable. Like it is. It's unthinkable that the God or Heavenly Father, even when I was Mormon, and believed, that story never felt good in my heart. Like I could not imagine Heavenly Father, the God that I loved and felt love from, would ever ask that of his child.
I think that some of the ways Christians would deal with that would be in thinking that, but he went up knowing God would supply, and that he wouldn't have to. Somehow he knew he wouldn't have to kill the son, and whether the story's true or whether you agree with that kind of a take, the Christians generally do not look at it as though that they that it was a test and that God was not going to let him go through with that. I'm not saying that's a good answer or it solves anything, but that's the way a Christian would be more likely to think of it. And in that sense, it wouldn't be equal to the way the Mormons are using
Yeah.
the Abraham test, because God doesn't have him go through with it. He provides a lamb, whereas the way the Mormons are using it, you go through with it. The Abrahamic test is to take this woman as a plural wife, and then you go ahead and do it.
Yeah.
Whereas the Abrahamic test would be, oh, God would say, oh, no, it'll be fulfilled already. Just the fact that you're faithful to your one wife you got, that's enough.
Yeah. And if anyone knows the history of like Jim Jones and the People's Temple
Yeah,
of
that's what I was
Guyana,
gonna say.
you want to go ahead?
Well, I was just gonna say that this story is usually used whenever this story is used as an Abrahamic test and as an example of how God will test people. It turns out that the people most likely will be like a religious leader from a high demand group who is trying to make you do something that you're not comfortable with. And this story is used even outside of religious circles just to promote this idea of, this is it's important to test people, or like,
Yes, for total obedience.
right, exactly.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
Jim Jones would have his followers drink Kool-Aid, tell them it was poison.
Yeah.
They would drink it, and then he'd say, "Oh, it was just a test. It was just an Abrahamic test. There's no poison in it." Except eventually there was poison in it,
Right.
and then 100 or a couple hundred died, or however many died. So
Right.
I just don't see God also, if this is a story that he's putting into his Bible, that from that point on, whenever I hear this story from a high demand religion, it's used in such a wrong way, like such a way to take control over another human being. And maybe that's why it just doesn't feel like it would come from God to me.
and you make a great point, Sandra. It's a bad comparison purely because Abraham didn't have to go through with it.
Yeah.
Right.
And
definitely.
generations of women and men in Mormonism did.
Yes.
That's a great point. Okay, so this is fun. We're only in slide 3. All right, so we're now on to slide 4. So let's go ahead and play the next slide that is quoting from the Happiness Letter. Now, Sandra or Gerardo, do either of you want to kind of give a little context, or should we play the slide first?
I think we can give you context.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah. So, I mean,
We should have the show notes,
yeah.
Jonathan Streeter's treatment of the Happiness Letter,
Yeah.
and Bill Reel and RFM on Mormonism Live or on Radio Free Mormon, one of the two, or on Bill's podcast. They talk about it, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's there's so much context around the happiness letter, and if you really want to understand what went on and what was happening, you need to watch the 2.5 hour episode by Jonathan Streeter on and Beal Real. And then they have another person called Chris Smith on
Yeah.
it.
Christopher Smith.
Yeah. And it's just kind of like you'll understand so much of the context of polygamy and how Joseph was handling all of it and the sources and stuff. But basically, the happiness letter is a letter that is attributed to Joseph Smith. And basically he dictated the letter to convince Nancy Rigdon.
Sidney Rigdon's daughter.
Yes.
Yeah.
To go ahead and enter into polygamy and marry Joseph. It's very interesting that the church has used that letter, because the actual source that we have for that letter is John C. Bennett, and it's on his expose where he has the transcript of the letter, and that's the earliest source that we have. But the church has used it from very, very early, has used the letter and has accepted as coming from Joseph Smith. Something that Jonathan Streeter says is like, if you accept the letter, you have to accept the context that John C. Bennett is giving, because John C. Bennett is the one that's providing the letter. And anyway, so they go on the on their podcast episode, and they go through like what was going on, how Joseph was trying to approach Nancy, and eventually Nancy said no, rejected him. It became into this whole big mess because Sidney Rigdon found out and was not very happy about it. Joseph tried to deny that he ever proposed marriage to Nancy. And because then later the letter was leaked, or John C. Bennett gets a hold of it and publishes it, then Joseph and his associates just start dragging Nancy through the mud and saying that she was a whore, and like all sorts of horrible stuff. And then eventually Sidney has to go and plead with Joseph to stop that, and Sidney has to write something in the newspaper saying, or I'm not remember, but Sidney has to publish something saying that he acknowledges that Joseph didn't propose marriage to Nancy or something like that. He does a very careful worded denial on Joseph's stuff. But anyway, so it's just the whole context is really interesting, and the fact that the church uses it. And Hank Smith will quote from it. He won't say where it's coming from, but he just says, "Oh, Joseph said this." The letter, Jonathan Streeter goes through like about an hour just dissecting the letter and how coercive language it has, and how the whole letter, it's about convincing Nancy that, well, things that you might think they're bad are sometimes actually not bad.
Things that are wrong in one context
Yeah.
are right in another.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
It's kind of grooming. It's
Yeah.
kind of grooming.
Yeah.
But you have to remember, it doesn't mention polygamy.
Right.
That's why the church ends up using parts of the letter as faith promoting comments to give the youth about things that Joseph Smith said. But it's innuendo. It does not directly try to convince her of polygamy. It tries to convince her that God doesn't always say the same things. That God can say one thing one day and another thing another day, and that you shouldn't be too picky on if God contradicts something he said the day before.
Yeah. Something also that's really interesting about the letter is that it says that once you're in the church, you receive blessings because of living the commandments. But then if you're giving another commandment and you don't accept or live that commandment, then you will lose not just the blessings that will come from that new commandment, but you will lose the blessings that you received for all the other stuff. So you will lose all your blessings. So it's pretty coercive language where like Nancy is being told, like, if you don't accept what will come next, or what it's coming, then you might lose, every blessing you have.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. Well, let's play the clip and then we'll talk a little bit about more. All right, here we go. They're going to bring up the happiness letter.
Where Joseph Smith says this, he says, that which is wrong under one circumstance may be, and often is right under another. God said, "Thou shalt not kill." At another time, he has said, "Thou shalt utterly destroy." This is the principle on which the government of heaven is conducted. Revelation adapted to circumstance. Revelation adapted to circumstance. Whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, although we may not see the reason till long after the events transpire. I bring this up with Nephi killing Laban in the Book of Mormon, that we've grown up with it, and so we're pretty used to it. But someone who is a first-time reader of the Book of Mormon might be horrified by the idea of Nephi killing Laban, right? And so I don't think anyone needs to come into plural marriage feeling good about it, like, oh, this is a good thing. I feel so warm and fuzzy inside, right? I don't think that's the Lord's expectation. He's just saying, this is revelation adapted to circumstance. This is my law. This is how we're going to do this. So I don't know. I like the comparison with Nephi killing Laban, that it's an exception, not the rule. But you have to trust Nephi and trust the Lord that this is really from him.
I think that's another really powerful explanation for why we have this verse 36 that otherwise doesn't seem to fit. And it's because that is the rule is, do not sleep with anyone other than your
spouse,
your wife, the person you're married to. But then here's the situation, just like Abraham's situation, just like Nephi's situation, where you do something different.
I think that's exactly why it's.
I am just blown away that they're basically saying, hey, it's not so bad. It's kind of like this murder that we read about. Like, polygamy is not so bad. It's kind of like murder, right?
Why does this bother you?
Why? I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, that story of Nephi and Laban is heinous. It's what the Lafferty brothers used to kill the pregnant woman that's covered in under the banner of heaven. Why
Right.
would you want to use murder as an example of why polygamy is not so bad?
Yeah.
Because it's kind of like murder. Do you have a thought on that, Sid?
No, my mind's blown.
Lori Daybell also used that story to justify a lot of the things she was doing. You know, that we know that her kids ended up dead, and several of her husbands, and she would constantly refer to that Laban and Nephi story. We
Yeah.
have recordings of her referring to that story.
And then, Jen, I'm just going to ask you, because you have 4 daughters, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you're a mother of 4 daughters. Let's say they join a church, and in the church, the general rule is married men shouldn't have sex with teenage girls who are unmarried. Let's just say that's the rule. And then the preacher of that church isolates one of your daughters, hands her a letter, and the letter says, hey, daughter of Jen Camp, what's wrong in one circumstance can be right in another, when what he's actually saying is, hey, sometimes God makes an exception. In this case, he's making an exception for me to have you as a wife. Like, what would you think?
He would be arrested promptly.
Yeah.
No, that wouldn't fly. No.
Let me read again how this starts. Happiness is the subject and design of our existence. He turns it to happiness. Well, I don't think that's going to make us mothers very happy, but
Correct.
Or the
happy
daughters.
or the daughters.
Yeah.
Happiness is the object and design of our existence.
And actually, something that was really interesting that Jonathan Streeter mentions is that Nancy's dad,
Rigdon.
yeah,
Sydney.
Sydney had done a funeral, and on the funeral, like he gave like kind of like this speech, and the speech he included like a lot of the ideas on happiness, a lot of the language he was using. So it was kind of like Joseph using his dad's language, her dad's language, and include it into the happiness letter.
Yeah, he goes on to say, happiness is the object and design of our existence and will be the end thereof, if we pursue the path that leads to it. So he's grooming her right there. I've tried to talk to you about polygamy. Polygamy is the object that we're designed for in our existence, and polygamy if we follow it to the end. So he goes on, and actually says, if we pursue the path that leads to it, and this path, now here's a real mind bender. So he's trying to get her to go into polygamy, which is illegal and behind Emma's back. So this path is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God. So the first few things, oh yeah, that sounds really good. That sounds godly. And then you throw in, the important part is you're going to keep all the commands of God. And by the way, God just commanded me to ask you to be my plural wife.
Yeah.
And so it's putting her on the horns of a dilemma of how do you be virtuous and keep all the commandments of God? Because now all the commandments include God's prophet can ask you to marry him secretly and not tell his wife about it.
Right.
And the rule.
Yeah.
And he's breaking the rule. The one rule.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Several. We'll see later.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot
Yeah.
of them. Most of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's slide five. That's slide 4. Slide 5. All right. So we're going on now to slide 6. And now we're going to bring in David, and we're going to talk about the restoration of all things. So I'll just go ahead and start reading. They're going to be covering verses D&C 132, verses 37 through 39. And it says, Abraham received concubines. Now I'm just going to stop there. They're about to start talking about the main, tell me if I'm wrong, Sandra, the main justification is, tell me if this is right in Joseph's mind, that God's saying to Joseph, we need a restoration of all things, right?
Yep.
And if we need a restoration of all things, and if Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and David, and Solomon all practice polygamy, then of course, Joseph, it's just really important that you practice polygamy too. Am I following the right logic so far?
Right. But that would make you restore all sorts of things in the Old Testament that we wouldn't want coming back.
Right.
So
Like eating pork and stoning adulteresses and all sorts of things. But I just want to also make the point that if we're going to rely on this logic train that there needs to be a restoration of all things, and here we have mentioning in verse 37, the third word is concubines.
yes.
What does that mean?
It means you're secondhand, inferior, lower level marriage partner, but you have no rights of inheritance or honor or position in the community as a wife does. So, I mean, why is God throwing in concubines? Why isn't it just wives? And I find this very strange that they would want to throw that in with their eternal marriage. So do we have concubines in Joseph Smith's group? Were some of those wives not to be recognized as legitimate plural wives? They were just servants of the wives. It's a funny add-in.
I mean, I want to sort of define the word concubine as kind of like a sex slave, right?
Yeah.
I don't know how else to think about it. But it says here in verse 37, Abraham received concubines, and they bore him children, and it was accounted unto him for righteousness.
Yes.
So if concubines are righteousness, and there needs to be a restoration of all things, Jen, am I stretching things here? Why didn't God then command Joseph to have concubines?
Because I don't believe God commanded him to do any of this.
But the logic,
Yeah, if he's supposed to restore all things, then in this DNC, then he should have restored all things.
yeah.
If that's what he said he was doing, then that's the way it should be.
And he's saying that his concubines bore him children that were counted unto him in righteousness. So clearly God was okay with these sex slaves back then. And then why isn't he okay with them now? I wonder if that's part of ongoing revelation. I wonder if Russell M. Nelson is going to come up with a new revelation announcing concubines as a new
Restoration.
of all things.
I think he's just sticking with more wives.
Okay. All right. Well,
It's
anyway,
easier to get your wife's consent for more
Yeah.
wives than concubines.
especially if your wife's dead, which his wife, first wife
Oh,
was.
right. That's,
Yeah.
that's the other thing that worries so many Mormon women is if I die first, my husband can marry again, and he'll come out in the resurrection with more wives that I never approved of.
Well, we're beating a dead horse, but I continue. So verse 37.
I just wanted to say
yeah.
that actually the story goes that when she proposes to Nancy Rigdon, when Joseph does, Joseph tells her, "Oh, I'll take you as a concubine, but if you don't really like that idea, I'll take you as a wife." That's what the story
Oh my
says.
goodness.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Joseph
it get
was-
worse.
So Joseph was trying to restore the concubine.
yeah. John C. Bennett says that yes, he was.
Oh, but John C. Bennett and Joseph had a falling out, so we can't trust.
Well, we trust the happiness letter
I
that came
know.
from John C.
I know,
Bennett.
it's so crazy. Okay, verse 37 continues. And it was accounted, okay, no, because they were given unto him and he abode in my law. Again, that's just, it's like women are handed around as cattle
Yes.
They were.
in
They
you
were.
know, it's like God's like, okay, I'll give you these wives and these concubines and yeah. Okay. Let's see. And he abode in my law, and Isaac also and Jacob did none other things than that which they were commanded, because God does that. And because they did none other things than that which they were commanded, they have entered into their exaltation according to the promises and sit upon the thrones and are not angels, but are what?
Gods.
Gods. I thought we didn't know. I don't know if we emphasized or, really
Well,
focused on that.
you have to pay attention to whether gods is capitalized or not capitalized,
Okay.
because there's evidently different levels of gods.
Okay.
Whether you get a capital or not. But in the original, I believe it's capitalized.
Oh, wow.
And
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And we mentioned last time that Gordon B. Hinckley, when he was asked about this doctrine, can men become gods? He said, I don't know that we teach it. I don't know that we emphasize it. And he must have not remembered D&C 132 verse 37.
Because we don't emphasize it.
Yes.
we have to have a separate podcast where Kate Holberg is talking about it. It's not on the Come Follow Me manual.
Yeah.
Also, the capital G thing is an interesting sideline study, because like in the King Follett sermon, one of Joseph's last sermons, he talks about becoming gods and things in there. And as I recall, the originals use capital G. So early Mormons did not shy away from a concept of becoming big G gods.
Yeah.
Nowadays, they have taken the capitalizations out of many of the documents when they publish them, so that you don't understand and grasp that they really mean full godhood to these people.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I didn't know that. I think that's a big deal.
Yeah.
Because I think a big apologetic argument is like that I've heard. I think it was for Mormon is like, oh, it's God's and it's not capitalized, so it might not mean actual like Heavenly Father God
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay, verse 38. David also received many wives and concubines, and also Solomon and Moses, my servants, as also many others of my servants, from the beginning of creation until this time. And in nothing did they sin, save in those things which they received not of me. So God's okay with all that polygamy and concubinery. Goes on to verse 39. David's wives and concubines were given unto him of me by the hand of Nathan, my servant, and others of the prophets who had the keys of this power. And in none of these things did he sin against me, save in the case of Uriah and his wife. And therefore he hath fallen from his exaltation and received his portion, and he shall not inherit them out of the world. And I gave them unto another, saith the Lord. Really quickly, when he says, I gave them unto another, saith the Lord, what does he mean by them?
Wives.
Right. Did you catch that? Anyone catch why that's problematic?
That's what they did when Joseph passed away, right? They gave his wives to Brigham and other men.
Yeah, the
I-
main group of Joseph's wives, widows, were split between Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and who was
Ugh.
the third main one? Uh, mm,
Wilford Woodruff or
Heber C.
Yeah.
Kimball got to have like 40 plus wives before Joseph died. So he
yeah,
got more after
yeah.
Joseph.
Well, I can't remember the count, but
Yeah.
but there was a whole bunch of Josephs of Brigham and Hebrews and others that took Joseph Smith's plural wives. Not all of Joseph's plural wives got passed on to somebody else. I think some of them were older and probably didn't care about going on to some other guy. And maybe some weren't able to have children. So if you're looking for seed, if you have a woman past childbearing, she may not want to even go marry it. But we see a great pattern of Brigham's taking of Joseph's wives as though they are
Objects.
swapping, objects, like I got 3 Mercedes. Do you want 3 of them? Or, I don't know. It just seemed like treating him as property.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's kind of disingenuous for Kate Holbrook to be even using the word consent, for any of them to use the word consent. We're all repulsed by Joseph Smith handing out women to men for favors. We're all repulsed by Brigham Young handing out wives as favors to his friends and buddies. We're all repulsed by Warren Jeffs deciding whose daughters get to marry his buddies. But what's powerful, and I never realized this, is in verse 39. It's God who's modeling this behavior, because it says here, "For I gave them unto another, saith the Lord." So Jesus basically reassigned David's unapproved wives and concubines to other men. So God is the author of treating women like cattle, according to this verse.
And like, even, I don't even want to say even harsher, but like pointing out what Sandra said, that after Joseph passed away, the men all get together or whatever they did and decide, oh yeah, that one's too old, we don't need to marry her to someone else. Oh, that one hasn't had any kids yet, so we're just gonna not marry her to anyone else. They'll just be helpers, or we'll just leave them here in Nauvoo. And to like, that just is so infuriating as a woman, to be like, oh yeah, you're no good. Oh, that part, you can't do that. You're no good. And they're just going through like they're not even human. And that is not okay. That's not okay in any way.
Yeah.
So
And we haven't even played the clip yet.
sorry.
No,
Yeah.
it's good.
Yeah.
Let's play. Should we play the clip?
Mhm.
All right. So here's the clip.
It's in there.
Wow, this is intense scripture.
I'll
Let's
say.
keep going.
I'll
Kate.
say.
Keep walking us through this.
So then we get several scriptures again looking to ancient prophets who had more than one wife, and it explains that most of them, it was accounted unto them for righteousness. They were not sinning when they did this, because they were doing it according to God's will. But then one of them did not do it according to God's will. This is verse 39 with David. So at first it was okay. It says, "In none of these things did he sin against me, except in the case of Uriah and his wife." We know that's Bathsheba. David sees her bathing, desires her, sleeps with her, and then doesn't want to get caught, so sends him to the front lines where
Sends
in
Uriah
battle
to be killed. Oh,
he's sure to be killed.
I
Yeah.
remember the jaw drop that I had in seminary when I learned that the same David, hero David, who slew Goliath, was this same David. I thought, wait, but
no. Yeah.
he slew Goliath.
Such a disappointment.
So
Yeah.
8-foot giants are no problem, but your own lust. Oh man, that was a sad day.
Yeah. And so we see what happens to him? David hath fallen from his exaltation. He received his portion already. He shall not inherit more out of the world. God gave that portion, that heavenly, those thrones and principalities and powers. Those are given unto another person.
Oh, so it wasn't wives given to another person. It was thrones and principalities. So God had a certain number of thrones and principalities reserved for David. And then David blew it. So he gave those thrones and principalities, not wives,
Yeah.
to others.
Well,
That's
he
not
had
what
to
I-
have wives for all those kingdoms, though.
Isn't it interesting that in the LDS Church we feel really okay about throwing David in under the bus and saying how horrible it was, how he disobeyed God, and putting him up as an example of like what not to do, and how he lost, his exaltation, and how terrible it was what he did. But then they want to offer Joseph Smith all the grace in the world and how he lived polygamy, even when he went against the way God was commanding it to be lived. Like, why is there a double standard between David of the Bible and Joseph Smith?
That's a great question.
Right, because further on in the Revelation, it says if a man have 10 virgins, he hasn't sinned,
Right,
and yet he marries about 12 women with living husbands.
right.
So why isn't that counted a sin like with Bathsheba?
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, by the way, Bathsheba never gets named. So isn't that just fitting that it doesn't say Beth? It doesn't even have the grace to name her. It says in the case of Uriah and his wife.
Yes,
So does that-
property.
yeah, it's not Bathsheba. It's Uriah's wife.
Yeah.
Kind of this cattle kind of
Mhm.
this cattle situation again. All right. I mean, we're kind of being hard. We're all a little bit upset. I'm just going to check in. We're all kind of really critical and negative. Why is that?
Because it was against the law and because he lied to everyone. He wasn't just lying a little bit. He publicly, time after time, said in the pulpit, what a thing it is that I'm accused of having 7 wives when I can only find one. I'm the same innocent guy I was when I got married. And he gives these denunciations of people that practice polygamy. Of course, they'll say, well, they did it without authority. But he never says he did it with authority in public. Every statement of Joseph in public was to deny polygamy. And yet this man is held up to us as God's example of a true prophet of God called to restore the church that has been in disarray for almost 2,000 years. And then the guy we're supposed to follow is lying to his wife, lying to his church, lying to his community, lying to everyone in the nation. I don't see this as setting an example of how a man of God should live.
Yeah. And then Jen, I'll just ask you, how does it make you feel to hear that Jesus, which is Mormon Lord is Jesus, Jesus is giving these revelations in the
You're right.
Doctrine and Covenants, right, Sandra?
Yeah.
How does it make you feel, Jen, to know that Jesus is the one handing out all these women to other men and is approving all of this stuff?
Yeah, the Jesus that I know does not. So I don't. This was my shelf breaker. I just want to let everyone know that. And so all of this is really hard for me, like this subject. Because I don't believe it came from God. I don't believe Christ or Jesus would approve of any of this. And so it's just hard it's hard for me because even in trying to restructure my spirituality and what I believe and what feels true within myself, I no matter what way Jesus, I don't believe he would ever approve of this. And so having that be said in the Doctrine and Covenants that this comes from him just does not feel right in any part of me.
Yeah. Thank you, Jen. That's heartfelt. And yet in verse 40, it goes on to say, I am the Lord thy God, and I gave unto thee my servant Joseph an appointment and restore all things. Ask what you will, and it shall be given unto you according to my word. So it's, yeah. Gerardo, were you going to say something?
No, think it's
Okay.
we can keep going.
Okay. All right. Okay. So we are on to the next slide. And, I think it's a discussion about boundaries and God's house being a house of order. So let's hear that.
Now, Kate, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I see in verse 39 the Lord saying, this principle I'm going to give you, plural marriage, has very strict boundaries. And
Yes.
you cannot cross those boundaries. This isn't a, okay, do whatever you want type thing if you want this. This is a strict law that we're going to carefully hold in line. Would I be correct in saying that in verse 39? This is very serious.
I think that's absolutely true. So I think we've learned two things so far. And the first is that the first wife should consent. And the second is that this is not a free for all. And the way this played out, the way my house is a house of order comes out in what we're talking about now is you had to ask the prophet, right? You couldn't practice plural marriage with authority unless you had Joseph Smith's permission, and then in Utah, Brigham Young's permission.
Sandra, I saw you smile.
Well, we've gone from needing to ask the wife's permission that gets passed over as not important. And now we got to have the prophet's permission, which evidently was one of the problems with Bennett, was the accusation that Bennett went out without asking Joseph and was doing it all on his own. But that's going to be a natural outcome of anyone that sets up this kind of a sexual program. When one guy gets to pass out favors and say, yeah, you can have plural wives. No, you can't. You're not worthy enough. Somebody's going to break out and say, well, why do I need your permission? If it's of God, I'll just go do it myself. It ended up creating just a horrible environment in Nauvoo, where who knew when it would be from Joseph or not? I mean, if people are going around claiming his authority, and we know that Joseph had some going around claiming his authority that were publicly telling people that it's not true. So how would you ever know who to believe?
Yeah.
I'm just befuddled, and you guys help me out with this, that they're like rejoicing that the scripture states that God's house is a house of order. And they're just so relieved that then polygamy had all these rules and structures. And I'm just thinking, how could they be saying that with a straight face, that somehow anything about this was ordered and structured?
I just don't think they know the history or don't remember. Honestly, like a lot of this I studied 3 years ago and I had forgotten. And it was preparing for this episode that I was just studying all this stuff again. And I was like, oh my goodness, this was crazy. It's just hard to look at the evidence and not see it as a sexual cult, like seriously, because
Sex cult,
sex cult, because it was just horrible. Like we have William Smith at some point, like Joseph's brother, who was an apostle, telling women like, oh, it's okay if single women are having sex with married men. As soon as the women are not married to other men, then it's fine. And she, at one point, William Smith, and this was testified by the woman, Catherine Fuller, where she says that William Smith, when she was about to get married, William Smith went to her and said, oh, don't get married because then I won't be able to have sex with you. And this is Joseph's brother, an apostle. Like, it's like Elder Oaks going out and telling this to a woman. So this was far from anything ordered and structured. And
Valerie writes, nothing about this can be considered a house of order. We already covered in last episode that the missionaries are doing this in 1831 only to the Native American women. And then Joseph's doing it in 1833, but Oliver Cowdery thinks it's a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. And all of that's happening before the sealing power was even given and before the revelations even given. And then even after that, Joseph Smith marries 22 women, violates his own law of Sarah, doesn't get consent with Emma, marries these twin sisters twice because Emma's pissed off and he wants to fool her.
Oh, Zina's story. That's an awful story where Joseph proposes to her before she's married. She says no. But Joseph still wanted her. And after Zina finds the love of her life, marries him, Joseph comes back and says, "Oh, God, it's threatened me with a with a drawn sword. If I don't marry you, then I'm going to be killed." And Zina finally gives in and says, "Okay, then I guess I'll marry you." It's just awful, awful stuff.
Yes. If you took the names out of this story and gave it to the average person to read, the average Mormon, they would think it was one of these splinter polygamous groups like Warren Jeffs, and I'm sure would condemn the whole thing as false doctrine. But it's when you put the Mormon approved names in, it changes your whole perspective on it. And everything can be allowed if it was the prophet or at the prophet's direction, when under any other circumstance, they would have condemned the whole practice.
Yeah.
It shows you the mind control there is in high control religions, and Mormonism is the pattern for that. You see it all through the consecration of property, being in Joseph's army, marrying women. He gets to have control of the church finances. It's all just set up as one man has the right to tell you anything is from God that he feels led to say, and you have no recourse. There's no scripture you can use as a corrective
Yeah.
to a leader that has gone off the rails.
There's no checks and balances. Like
Right.
how do you tell if the prophet, what if he turns out like David? How do we know if he was another David from the Bible? There's no way to know.
No, because it all goes by testimony.
Yeah.
And we're taught that as children. Everything is through emotion, through feeling, through praying about something. Just as you obey your parents, you obey your prophet. And whatever the prophet says is from God. So we grow up submitting to all these things. And like you're saying at BYU, you grow up with rose-colored glasses on a lot of this stuff that keeps you from doing an evaluation of the situation that in any other circumstance you would have seen couldn't have been from God.
Yeah, and growing up in the church, the reason why all of this, mainly some points of it, were my shelf breaker was because for 43 years, I did not ever learn this. I was never taught this. It was never shown to me, never taught in curriculum. And it was shocking. And it broke my heart. And it's not taught in the normal classrooms or primary young women's Relief Society. I learned about this in trying to find an answer for someone that I love. And then I found and came upon all of this, and it shattered me. So it's not okay. It's not okay to hide it from women in the church, and it's not okay the way that it's been structured and hidden. It's just not okay. So
Yeah. And now that you're saying this, Jenna, it just makes me think of all these people that I've met who say, "Oh, I knew about Joseph Smith's polygamy since like I was young. Like I'm not troubled about this stuff." But then really, do you know about Joseph Smith's polygamy, or do you just know he practiced it? Like, do you know the stories of the women, what happened with them? Like, I think it would be really hard to find someone that, I mean, we have Kate Holbrook here, which is like ignoring a bunch of this important context and stories of these women and painting. She's the one that's supposed to know all these stories,
Yeah.
and she's completely dismissing all the troubling information and painting like a nicer picture.
Yeah, and she's stating things like all the women, she used
Mhm.
all the women had grand spiritual experiences.
Right.
That's untrue,
Yeah.
and she knows it.
Yeah.
Like, she knows, like, firsthand journal writings from women that are total opposite of that.
Mhm.
And she's a historian, like, she knows better, and she's painting a picture that all women just were so excited about this, and they had these big spiritual experiences that said, that they should do this. That's not the case.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. What do you do when the guy in charge, you can't put the fox in charge of the hen house? What do you do when the guy who's in charge of the polygamy is potentially a predator?
You
Like-
do like William Law and set up an opposition newspaper exposing his secret teachings and try to get the public aware of what's going on. And then the Mormons go and burn out his press and essentially run him out of town. And so it's been a problem all through Mormon history of those that are doing whistleblowing or try to bring awareness to people. There's a big backlash against them.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, so much for their house of order. It's just weird that they're all so excited.
I think there's
About-
another clip where they talk about it even more
Yeah.
in depth. But
Okay. All right. Well, let's go to the next. Let's go ahead and go to the next clip. We're going to talk about John C. Bennett. Here we go.
Permission.
Isn't that Joseph's conflict with John C. Bennett? Is John C. Bennett is seeing his, hey, I can do whatever I want here. And Joseph is, no, this is strict.
Yes. And John C. Bennett had not been brought into this story of Joseph. Like, he just heard rumors, but he hadn't invited, Joseph Smith had not invited him to practice plural marriage, but he took those rumors and used them. And so did a few other of his friends, use them to seduce women, saying, and because they were friends with Joseph Smith, women believed them. I have authority. Joseph Smith has told me that I have authority to sleep with women that I'm not married to, and did. And then those women had to come up on public trial. And we don't know a lot of detail about plural marriage in Nauvoo because it was secret, and people didn't even write. Most people, there are a couple of exceptions, didn't even write about it in their journals. But we do have these court cases of people who were seduced and deceived. And
So because this could be so abused, the Lord is putting very strict rules on it. And he uses David as an example.
mm-hmm. And another evidence of why we learned early in this section, my house is a house of order. You can see how high the stakes are with that by the time you get here.
And I'm glad about that. I don't know. There's something about that that says, yes, I'm going to command this, but this is a very strict, careful principle that we're going to live. That gives me confidence moving forward with this.
I'd like to make sure, and I want to.
So, Sandra, would you mind telling us about John C. Bennett? Because he's one of the most important characters in the history of Mormonism that Mormons have never heard of.
Well, Joseph seems to be enamored of strong personalities. And so Bennett was immediately accepted into the group, and Joseph puts him up to be mayor of Nauvoo. and he's put up with some very important positions. One of the things she mentioned that I was surprised about is how she knows. How would she know that Joseph didn't teach Bennett polygamy?
Right.
I mean, he could have done that and still gone rogue, whatever you want to say about that.
Exactly.
But how does she know Joseph didn't teach it?
Yeah.
We know in his book, his expose he writes on this whole thing, he knows some of the women that are plural wives because he uses their names only with the asterisks of the first letter of their first and last name. And so now historians can go back and look at who he mentions, and we can plug in the actual name of the women. It shows he did have inside knowledge. I mean, you have to be an insider to know who these women were. It wasn't listed in the newspaper. So I think there's always an attempt to tear Bennett down to the lowest mean person when we don't know what really was going on behind the scenes with him and Joseph. He could have had a lot of teaching by Joseph on polygamy for all we know.
Yeah. And Jonathan Streeter mentions a lot on their podcast that a lot of John C. Bennett's testimonies were or exposés were corroborated by other sources as well. So it's not just, and that's how we know that John C. Bennett was in the inn. I mean, he was at some point even second church command and stuff. So
right.
Wasn't he co-president
yeah,
at some point?
yeah,
I don't
something
remember.
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Like William Law was later, like Oliver
Yeah.
Cowdery was
Yeah.
before. Why is it that the assistants to Joseph Smith always end up claiming that he was an adulterer? Like
Because they
Oliver?
were bad guys.
No, Oliver,
yeah.
right? So we have at least four: Oliver Cowdery, John C. Bennett,
Mm-hmm.
William
Law, and
Sidney Rigdon for a
Sid-
time.
Sidney Rigdon. Like all of them basically said Joseph Smith was an adulterer. Why? And getting kicked out. Why?
Because there can only be one king in the country. And if you started looking like a threat to the other guy leading the place, then the top guy's going to push him out.
Yeah. I was going to mention this. LDS Discussions just brought it up. Kate Holbrook tries to make it sound like John C. Bennett was tried. She says with his friends,
Yeah.
with by going rogue on polygamy. It was not just his friends. He was tried with Joseph's brother, William Smith. And then at some point during the trial, Joseph, right when they're gonna get his testimony, Joseph stands up and says,
I'm not going to hear this anymore.
Yeah, I'm not going to hear this anymore. And then Brigham Young just ends the trial, and they don't really say much about try him. But that's kind of disingenuous because William Smith was an apostle. He was not just one of John C. Bennett's little friends.
Yeah, crony or something.
Right, exactly.
Well, one of the other things I thought was curious about what she was saying, I thought she was implying that several of the women went on trial.
Yeah, they were. They did.
They did?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
Okay.
And that's where we get the stories of some of the stories of William Smith and how he was involved. Like I think at some point women were asked, like, why is Joseph denying all this stuff outside, but then how did you rationalize that with why would you accept that Joseph was
Okay.
in on this if he is denying it outside and stuff like that? But
Well, it must be a black hole in my memory. Okay.
maybe, I don't know, I could be wrong.
So, no, I have to go back and do a little refreshing.
Sandra, what's your take on what happened? So clearly John C. Bennett, he was the one who took the Nauvoo Charter to the Illinois
Yeah.
legislature to approve Nauvoo. He was clearly Joseph's co-president or right-hand man. He was able to list Joseph's plural wives. So, but then Joseph says, well, he was off doing an illegitimate form of spiritual wifery I was doing legitimate plural marriage, even though I was denying it and lying to Emma about it. But somehow William Bennett was doing illegitimate spiritual wifery, and it wasn't approved of. What do you think really happened as you read the history?
Well, that could have really been the issue, that if you have two corrupt men and one starts to look like he's after your job, you'd start pushing him out. So they obviously had some kind of leadership challenge.
Falling out.
Yeah, fouling out of some sort.
Chris Smith's argument, actually, and Jonathan Streeter's too, is that John C. Bennett got caught. And that was the problem. Like, John C. Bennett was not being careful and not being too secretively. And because it was because of John C. Bennett's not being really careful about he was approaching these women and more rumors spreading, they had to kind of he had to be the sacrificial lamb kind of thing. Because most of the rumors that had gone out were around his the way he was approaching it.
Yeah, sounds right.
Yeah, Mormons really need to think about that he's Joseph's right-hand man. He's doing the same things Joseph's doing, but somehow Joseph condemns it after they have a falling out. Joseph condemns it as illegitimate when it was the same stuff Joseph was doing. Isn't that a little fishy?
Yes.
Yeah, if you really want to understand it, like, and a lot of you should go listen Chris Smith and Jonathan Streeter talk about this.
We'll include that in the show notes as well.
Good.
Okay. Yeah. And again, Hank Smith just feels more confidence in the restoration because John C. Bennett's behaviors was condemned. Why doesn't that make you feel better about Joseph Smith? Because he condemned John C. Bennett, Sandra. Hank feels good about it.
Because we're only looking at a small part of the story. All of Nauvoo Mormonism is full of problem areas. And if you can weave in and out of the problem areas, you can make it look like a nice development in Nauvoo, but there's another side to the story. So it's the editing they're able to do around the public knowledge of Nauvoo that when you hear it and aren't prepared for it, it's very shocking and troubling for you, because you start realizing you were spoon-fed half a story. I grew up knowing that Joseph Smith gave the revelation on polygamy. I don't know why it never occurred to me that he must have lived it. I just never really thought about it. I grew up knowing my great-grandma, who was the last polygamous wife of Brigham Young Jr., and it never really occurred to me to even ask how many wives there were or how she was able to deal with polygamy, because everyone else was dead and she could just tell the story the way she wanted. All I heard was great stories of how God protects polygamists from being arrested, but I didn't get any of the surrounding story. So there's so much of polygamy that is so shocking when you hear the whole story, and yet people will say to me, "Oh, it doesn't bother me." And I think, well, then I don't think you've read enough because it should bother you.
Yeah. Yeah. I for me, this is why the Gospel Topics essays and modern Mormon neo-apologetics are dishonest and kind of gaslighting, because there's no reading of this history that doesn't conclude that it's super chaotic and confusing. And yet here, Hank Smith and Kate Holbrook and John By the Way are going, isn't God a God of order? Isn't it amazing that God had rules and structure for the polygamy and the plural marriage with Joseph and Nauvoo? And it's basically, I don't know that they're doing it on purpose, but it has the effect of just, these are not the George you're looking for. There is no confusion here. God is a God of order. Joseph Smith did polygamy under God's law with order, even though it's completely chaotic. Jen, you had some other reactions as well.
Yeah, that was the reaction I was having when I was watching that video, because they repeat it. They say God had very strict rules that he gave to Joseph. This was all given with very strict rules. And then you look at it you look at the stories and you look at how the timeline, and he didn't follow those very strict rules. And so I don't understand like why they're presenting it that way when they all know that the rules weren't followed. Even if it was, you know,
Yeah.
the way it was presented in DNC, he didn't follow them. So I don't understand their why they're emphasizing that.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Thanks, Jen. All right. Well, so we're just a few verses in, and we're not going to make much more. Actually, we're coming up to all the verses that they actually address in the entire episode. Let's go ahead and go to the next clip.
Want to restate something Kate said. So you had to be invited by the president of the church, by the prophet, to participate in this, whether that was Joseph or in Salt Lake Brigham. But there were some who lied and said that
Abused.
they had been, So I have heard percentages thrown around. I don't know, maybe this isn't the time to talk about it, but about how many were actually practicing this in Salt Lake era, for example. How many of the men of the church were practicing this in Salt Lake or Nauvoo? Do we know? Do we have good numbers?
We don't have good numbers. Not for lack of trying, but the people who have looked very closely at this still feel that there are too many sort of questions and not enough data to really come out with a secure number. We know it was not a majority of people; it was a minority of people, especially a minority of men.
That's what I think Elizabeth Keene called historical silence. Right? She said you got to get used to historical silence.
She has a lot of good phrases, good smart phrases. So
Gerardo, you didn't originally include that clip, but I wanted to include it because they're kind of laughing over this idea that just like, oops, sometimes we don't have the historical documents. And so we have what's called historical silence.
We don't have good numbers. It was super structured. God
Exactly.
loved, ordered, and super strict laws, but we don't have good numbers.
We have no idea who is marrying who. Sandra?
Well, and one of the things they throw out that confuses people is sometimes they will only try to give a percentage of the men that practice polygamy, which does not give you a picture of life in Utah, because you have all these women and children that are also involved in this polygamy lifestyle. So I've heard at different times when they've said, oh, only 2% of the church live polygamy. Well, that's 2% of the men. And then it's also 2% of the men in the Intermountain area. They aren't counting outside of our immediate environs here. So, well, like they say, they probably do have some sort of lack of data to figure it all out, because I'm sure a lot of people didn't have records kept of all of the marriages that took place. But how come we all end up being descendant from polygamists out here? I mean, there got to be an awful lot of them. And when you have men taking 50 women, how many leaders can take those enormous amounts of women without leaving a bunch of men with no one to choose from? They're taking an awful lot of women off of the marriage market when they do that.
But then they literally went to the United Kingdom and recruited young teenage girls and shipped them back to Nauvoo to replenish
and to Utah, not just to Nauvoo. Right. And that's why I forget who it was. One of the leaders told the missionaries, we don't want you picking over the women before they get on the boat. You wait till we need to all get a fair shot at this. You know, they got to get out here single.
I think it was Heber C. Kimball, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who said that?
Yeah. Okay. And I took umbrage at them kind of like marveling at this mystery of historical silence when we all know Joseph was hiding and lying this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they were literally not keeping records because they wanted to keep it secret. So they're
Yeah.
acting like sometimes in history there's just this magical historical silence.
Well, and they have the same problem here in Utah because the government was after them for years about polygamy. It didn't all just wait until suddenly 1890 the government started complaining about this. They had been searching to arrest different ones living polygamy for years before the manifesto. So again, they had no incentive to list out how many were involved in polygamy.
Okay. Well, this is basically the point where they stop actually talking about the verses and they're just now going to hit all the major issues that I think they are trying to respond to. So we'll go to the first one where they're talking about agency being essential and how Joseph Smith is a great example of everyone having agency. You guys ready for this one?
Yep.
Okay.
So we know there are clearly very specific ways to go about doing this, and then finally we know that agency is essential, and we see this in the way that Joseph Smith went about this. He didn't tell women they were going to be sealed to him or to someone else. He asked them and he invited them to go on their own and think about it and pray about it. That was a very important part of this process.
So what's the problem with the idea that because Joseph asked the women then and they could say yes or no, that Joseph was all about consent and agency? What's wrong with that?
Well,
Hey, Sandra, you go first.
I didn't hear Emma get mentioned, just the girls' consent. But even there, you have the stories of different girls saying that essentially they were coerced into polygamy and under spiritual pressure by the man they've been trained all their life to see as God's prophet. I mean, that's not informed consent. We see a pattern with Joseph Smith of grooming, where he's been in most of these girls lived in a Mormon home, and at times Joseph would have stayed in many of these girls' homes where the parents would have accepted him as God's prophet, where the parents would have been supporting him and taking his word as the word of God. And so when Joseph meets them when they're, say, 9, and they're given this hero worship of Joseph, he can later tap back into that to persuade them that, well, I'm a prophet of God. Your parents approved of me. You saw my actions in your home. And so when I tell you this is from God, you have to know it's really from God. So I think the religious pressure that would have been applied doesn't make it conform to real consent.
And Jen, I want to ask you too, what's wrong with using Joseph as a shining pillar of consent? He's a prophet viewed as a man who's next to Jesus in terms of God's, approval. And he's approaching teenage girls and 20-year-old girls and giving them the option. What's wrong with framing that as agency and consent?
Yeah, it's not agency at all because Joseph is in a position of power over not only the women, but their families. And it's not consent because he threatens or makes promises of salvation. But if you don't accept, then it means damnation to their families. So it's your families can be saved if you do this. Emma didn't know. Joseph was their prophet. Is another reason he would say that God came down and, with a flaming sword, or, said that he would kill him if he didn't ask this person to marry them, or he would go to the young girl's parents and say, if you give me your daughter in marriage, then your whole family is saved just by this one gift to me. And that's not consent. None of that is consent. So,
And by the way, can a 14, 15, 16, or 17-year-old girl give consent to a 38-year-old man? Is that even possible, Jen?
no,
Why not? It's
because their brain is not even developed. They're not like reading the journals of the young girls, like Helen Kimball, like reading her words and her heart being torn out because all she wanted to do was go to the dance and dance with the boys that were her age and, have this fairy tale that every woman usually has when they're young, of finding someone that they connect with and fall in love with. And she's crying and she is devastated and she's writing in her journal. She doesn't want this. She doesn't want it. And the only reason she's doing it, and the only reason her mom, who's also devastated, approves of it is because Joseph promises to save their whole family. And that is not consent in any way. That is wrong. And that is a male predator. And that is not okay. And that was never, ever taught to me.
yeah.
Well, I think it also brings in the problem of bringing your young children into the realm of justifying lying, and that you can keep secrets and things that you would be embarrassed about or ashamed of. You are being taught now that that's the way it's okay to live, which would confuse a child on when's a lie, and what do I say publicly? These girls had their lives suddenly changed where they had no normal social life as teens. So when people talk about, oh, well, you can get married at 14 in some states or 16 or whatever, trying to normalize the age on that, it wasn't legal. And the girls couldn't tell anyone about it. They couldn't say, oh, yes, I got married last Friday. The other girls that were getting engaged or got married, they could talk to people.
Yeah. Well, and then the story about Zina, right? And the drawn sword. So it says, like, I'll pull it up. It just says Zina later wrote that within months of her marriage to Henry, she wrote, Joseph sent word to me by my brother saying, tell Zina, I put it off and put it off till an angel with a drawn sword stood by me and told me if I did not establish that principle upon the earth, I would lose my position and my life. The Lord had made it known to him she was to be his celestial wife. So if there's an angel coming and threatening people with a drawn sword, like, is that agency?
Yeah, and you don't
No.
even need an angel in a flaming sword. Like this revelation, DNC 132, is all about how polygamy is important, polygamy is of God, polygamy is essential, polygamy is God's way. God gave all these different wives and concubines to all these prophets. It's the restoration of all things. It's got to be what goes on. It's the only way to have salvation. Well, is that giving a teenage girl like, well, maybe I can do it or maybe I won't? Like, even that isn't really offering much of an option
Yeah.
if you believe in God's
Yeah.
scriptures and in the revelation. Jen, were you going to say something too?
I was just going to read from Helen's journal.
Oh, yeah.
So everyone can hear her words. The LDS.org and places like to say she was a couple months shy of being 15. So let me just correct that. She was 14. She was 14 years old. So her father comes to her after Joseph has come to her father, and her father says, hey, your whole family will be saved if you give me Helen as a wife and an eternal companion. So both. And so he talks to his wife, and then his wife does not like the idea, but she says to talk to Helen. So he goes to Helen, and this is what she writes in her journal. And this is a quote from her journal now. But suffice it to say, the first impulse was anger. for I thought he had only said it to test my virtue. My sensibilities were painfully touched. I felt such a sense of personal injury and displeasure, for to mention such a thing to me, I thought altogether unworthy of my father. And as quick as he spoke, I replied to him, short and emphatically, no, I wouldn't. I had always been taught to believe in it as a heinous crime, improper, unnatural, and I indignantly resented it. And then she goes on to say later, my father had but one ewe lamb, but willingly laid her upon the altar. How cruel this seemed to my mother, whose heartstrings were already stretched until they were ready to snap asunder. None but God and his angels could see my mother's bleeding heart. When Joseph asked her if she was willing, she replied, if Helen is willing, I have nothing more to say. That breaks my heart. That breaks my heart. I was not taught this, and that is not okay. Helen didn't need to be saved. There were other boys at the dance she wanted to dance with. She didn't need to be married off to go across the plains. All these excuses that I was given and fed when I was in church, none of those applied to this little small 14-year-old girl or her parents or her mother that was devastated. I don't believe it. I don't believe.
Yeah. And then the way Joseph justifies it is to say, well, what's wrong in one circumstance can be right in another.
Yeah.
And that was beautiful, Jen. Thank you. That was very powerful and beautiful.
Yeah.
Gerardo?
I think we're going to talk about Helen
Yeah,
a
more,
little bit
yeah.
more, but
We are.
yeah, just keep in mind that Helen is mentioning there on that quote how hard it was for her mom, and I'll when we explain the context and why it was extra hard for her mom, will
But-
make more sense. But
But that Jen, you reading that now helps us. It makes
Yeah.
future comments even more outrageous.
for sure,
Because Kate Holbrook and others have read that. Have read
Yeah,
that
they
information.
know. Like they know that. I think that's even why it hurts so much more when you find this out, is that they know, like the apostles know, they know better. They're just not saying, they're not telling. Because I think we would not be okay with that.
And several of the viewers are saying, Jen, that was powerful. And they're thanking you for sharing. So, Jen, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now we're going to talk about Fanny Alger and why Fanny Alger is not a problem. Are you guys ready for that?
yeah.
Because God's is the house of order. Okay, here we go. Why Fanny Alger isn't a problem.
And let's talk about when this revelation, we talked about how this revelation came in July of 1843, but that is not the beginning of plural marriage. And again, there are a lot of question marks, but it looks like Joseph Smith was probably in about 1833 sealed to what was probably his first plural wife. And we don't know, with some unions, because women spoke later in Utah, signed affidavits on this, we know that there was a sexual relationship that was part of some of these marriages. And we also know that a lot of these marriages didn't have a sexual component. And we also don't have evidence of any of Joseph Smith having children with any of his plural wives. So what that ends up looking like is not all of these were marriages in the sexual sense. And even if they were marriages in the sexual sense, it wouldn't have been a lot, or there would have been children resulting from the unions. So
first of all, that's a lot of like possiblies or probablys or I'm not so sure's for a house of order. Did that strike you, Sandra, as
Well, yes, she's why are we assuming he wasn't having sex with all these women? Some women may not have been able to have children. Some girls could have been too young to conceive. It's
Oh,
not like
That's
he,
dark. Oh,
yes, that they were that young. Um, so there's so many questions there that they want to speculate everything was good, but why should we assume that? Maybe everything was not just that they didn't sleep together, but did they sleep together, have children, and have them aborted? Did they give them away to somebody else? There are other options of why no children surfaced. We know on a couple of the women that they had children that died in the Nauvoo time period. So we wouldn't know whether they were Joseph's child because in today's world, you can't get any DNA from that source.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of other options. He may have had a number of kids, but there's just a lot of unanswered questions there. But they're making a lot of assumptions that there was hardly any sex and certainly no children.
Well, we have several testimonies of the actual women who testified that the relationships were sexual in nature. And then there's also the fact that a third of the women that he married were already married to other women, so they were having
other
sex.
men.
Sorry, to other men. Yeah, and so they were having sex simultaneously with their husbands and Joseph at the same time. So if you really want to learn more about this, which is really fascinating, you need to watch Dan Vogel's series on Joseph Smith's polyandry, where he goes through every wife of Joseph Smith that was already married to other men, and basically he shows how on each case it is very, very likely that Joseph was having sex with every of those women, and he goes really in detail on with that.
We'll add that to the show notes.
Yeah.
That's a great idea. I do think it's preposterous that they're mentioning Fanny Alger in 1833 and not mentioning that no sealing power had been given yet and no polygamy revelation had been given yet. And somehow she's assuming that God told
There was a
Joseph
sealing.
that it
Yeah.
was a sealing. And there's literally, is there any evidence of that, Sandra?
No, it's just trying to back right into history things that would make it more acceptable to people. But I mean, she gets put out of the home. Some speculate that she was pregnant at that point. We don't know for sure, but it's a possibility. But Emma has her leave the house. So, I mean, of course, the record is that she found out about the union and whether it produced a child or not. The result, anyways, was that Fanny had to leave and go live with other people. When Emma found out about the whole situation, Fanny is out of time sorts with the Mormon story, and she's a fly in the ointment. She fouls up the narrative of how they want to tell the story, so they have to find inventive ways of getting around her.
And again, if Oliver Cowdery's calling Fanny Alger an affair
Yeah.
and he's assistant president of the church,
Mhm.
Yes.
that's a problem. That's not a house of order.
No.
Yeah. And he's not just calling it an affair. He's saying Emma found them together in the barn.
Yeah.
And then there was a ruckus made. And then that's how she found out about the affair. And it was, therefore called an affair.
Yeah.
Like Emma, bless her heart. Yeah.
And why if Brigham Young to whatever the prophet was before, like David O. McKay, like if all the Utah polygamist men were having sex with their wives, is there any question that they were all having sex with all their wives and having kids with why do apologists feel like it's in any way honest or ethical to try and downplay Joseph's sex when every other polygamous marriage was all about kids and sex and children? And the Book of Mormon even says in Jacob that if there's going to be an exception made for polygamy, it's for what reason?
Seed,
Seed.
Seed,
Kids.
which implies what?
sex.
Sex. So it's dishonest for people like Kate Holbrook or Brian Hales or any of the apologists to go, well, okay, there was some sex, but it wasn't a lot of sex, or it wasn't all sex, or there's no evidence of sex. That feels disingenuous to me.
Right. Of course, if these are legitimate marriages, why would they try so hard to get him from having any children? I mean, I would think they would be proud that he was fulfilling the Jacob command to raise up
Yeah.
seed. But everyone wants to try to prove he didn't have sex and there weren't any kids, as though they were ashamed of that if he had. So it doesn't fit with the rest of the narrative.
Yeah. And the Temple Lot case, I think Gerardo was talking about this a little bit earlier. Melissa Lott and Lucy Walker both testified that they did.
Mm-hmm.
And so under oath. So, there is evidence that the women said
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
there was.
Brian
So-
Hales has a section on his website where he has like the women that he accepts that there's enough evidence that there was sex, and which ones we don't have enough evidence according to him. But then Dan Vogel provides the evidence for almost the rest of them.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you were trying to prove I had sex with Gerald, my only proof would be I got 3 kids. But you're not going to find some diary entry where I'm keeping track.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. So it's a rhetorical, manipulative attempt to downplay the sex
Yeah.
as it relates to Joseph, because it's so seedy and chaotic and out of order.
And also, it was obvious that he was teaching it in a way that meant they were free to have children. Because you see, William Clayton, that Joseph Smith taught polygamy, he gets his wife's sister pregnant there in Nauvoo. Obviously,
Mhm.
Joseph's instruction to him on polygamy gave the go ahead to have a family by a polygamist wife. So why would I think Joseph would have lived it any different?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll bring this up later, but Heber C. Kimball, before Joseph proposes to Helen, or the marriage happens, Heber C. Kimball already had a polygamous wife, and he already had a kid with that polygamous wife.
Yeah.
Approved by Joseph. So it was, yeah.
Yeah.
It was not like Joseph was talking about, like he tries to say, like this just union of families and not thinking about it sexually.
Yeah, it's all just paperwork.
Right.
Okay. A little bit more about Fanny Alger and the angel with the flaming sword really quickly.
So in 1843, he has this revelation, because even though God told him to practice this, 10 years earlier, and he, more than 10 years, he resisted and resisted and resisted. And as he describes it, an angel came to him 3 different times saying, you have to do this, and finally threatened him with death and destruction and like problems it's a threat to his exaltation if he didn't do this. He finally began to practice plural marriage, but it was sort of a little bit at a time. And this period in Nauvoo is when he's practicing it a lot more. He has a number of wives by the time this revelation comes. And that has led some people to speculate that he asked for this revelation in order to appease Emma, because there were times when she was aware of what was going on and she felt okay about it, felt like it was God's will. And there were other times when it was so painful for her that she couldn't stand it and she was against it. So when
Yeah. So what do you guys think about, Sandra, what do you think about this idea that God told Joseph to practice polygamy in 1833? Again, where is Kate Holbrook getting this?
Well, you can't have Fanny Alger be an affair. So Joseph has a union with her. They have to admit that. So you have to some way posit that there was some kind of revelation before that, because surely he wouldn't have committed adultery. So because they start from a premise, he couldn't do adultery. Therefore, if he did have an affair with this girl, he had to be sealed to her. It's just a way of trying to put him in the best light. But there's nothing to show that that's the case. But then she makes it sound like time after time God's trying to get him to accept polygamy. No, time after time they're trying to get one particular girl to practice polygamy with him. He's already accepted polygamy. He's already living that. He's had any number of women through the years. So each time the angel comes with a flaming sword or whatever it is, it's to convince the girl,
A new woman.
a new woman, not for Joseph to practice polygamy. I mean, how many times you got to do it to prove to God you accepted it?
Yeah.
I mean, he's got 22 wives before he tells Emma that he's got a revelation on it.
He's keeping those angels
just-
he's keeping those angels really busy. Like I just have to say this. I've made this point before. Like, think of all the horrible things that have happened in the history of the world.
Yeah.
Child rape, child murder, like literal genocide, world wars, famine, disease. Do I need to go on? What is God, when God really wants something to happen or to stop something, he's going to send an angel with a flaming sword. And it wasn't for, Auschwitz.
No.
It wasn't for the pogroms in Russia. It wasn't to prevent the spread of COVID-19. It was to make sure Joseph could have sex with these teenage girls. Is that God? Is that your top priority? Your
Mhm.
most urgent, essential priority? Does that make any sense?
No, and it's one of the marks that we see in coercive cults,
Mhm.
that it's a repeated pattern of a man putting himself forward as God's prophet, who then includes in that the abuse of women in the group. And it may be a selective number of women in the group, but it seems to be a common thread going through like David Koresh, Jim Jones, whoever you want to bring up, that there is this thread of sexual misbehavior.
Keith Raniere with Nexium.
Yeah, that they then try to normalize.
Yeah.
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 Very interesting.
Yeah. Jen, you want to add anything?
I
Angel with the
it
flaming
just
sword.
yeah, angel with the flaming sword. It's just so wrong to me. And I don't like how they're like, oh, Emma, it was really, really hard for her sometimes, but then it wasn't sometimes.
Mm.
And I'm like, no, you don't know.
Yeah.
Like, you don't know that. You don't know. Maybe it was really, really hard for her all the time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, when did she ever feel good about this?
Yeah.
I want to know the reference.
Exactly.
yeah,
That's what I was
exactly.
gonna say.
I don't think that was correct.
Because we have Emma even editing Joseph's stuff, and then presenting it to the Relief Society so that to prevent women from accepting polygamy later if Joseph's proposed. And yeah, we have Emma resisting all along. I
And
think.
even when he finally asked her to be there to like
Yeah.
give the two sisters to him or
Mhm.
whatever, and then it's recorded right after that, she was like, no,
Yeah.
this is not okay, out of my house.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't see any sign of her ever writing down, oh, it was great, I was okay with it. Even after Joseph passes, she won't even admit to ever being polygamous.
Right.
So I never see her saying it's okay, ever.
Yeah.
And what's more likely, that God sends an angel with a flaming sword to make Joseph Smith have sex with a teenage girl, or that sort of story or narrative that Joseph didn't want to do it, that he was so against doing it that God had to force him to do it? What's more likely? Occam's razor. Let's Occam's razor this a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, it's just like those preachers of those different splinter groups, heretical groups that have, through the years, taken advantage of women in their congregation. It's very easy when you're a religious leader to pull the God card. Oh, it wasn't my idea. I didn't want to have sex with that 14-year-old.
Yeah.
That was God's idea.
Yeah.
It doesn't pass the smell test.
No.
I also want to bring up the fact that she mentions we can't really trust the idea that the revelation was
Should we play that clip?
given. I think it was that one.
No,
that
it's next. This is the next one.
Okay.
Let's play that. So the question is, can we trust William Clayton?
Yeah.
So Sandra, can we trust? We'll play the clip. But
Yes.
what do you think, Sandra? Can we trust William Clayton? I'm guessing he's going to say something that doesn't make the church look good. Is that safe to say? That when they're questioning whether you can trust a source,
Yes.
I'm guessing he wasn't saying something very favorable. But let's see. Let's see.
it. So when Joseph Smith received this revelation, he already had some plural wives. He was in the red brick store, which is such an important building upstairs. And, it was a store. So that's important for the community. That's where they could go to buy supplies and food. And upstairs is where they were studying together, where I think at this point it was still only men were preparing for the temple endowment, although that became women. Those early meetings were up here on the second floor. The Relief Society was formally organized and had a lot of their early meetings here on this second floor of the red brick store. So this building is a big deal. And Joseph Smith was in his office there. And William Clayton is the one who was scribe, who Joseph spoke the revelation, and William Clayton wrote it down. And William Clayton said, well, he's the one who said, well, Hiram came to Joseph and said, Emma is still resisting this. And so try to have a revelation. Maybe that will help her. But that's William Clayton is the source on that. So a lot of people have taken that to be the actual story, and it very well could be, but I'm not 100% convinced that is the story.
What do you think, Sandra? What's your?
Well, she's not convinced because she can't have Joseph doing anything wrong. Whatever he does must have been right. Clayton is the trusted scribe for the prophet of God, who stays faithful, who goes into polygamy, who comes out west and raises a big family. Why aren't we trusting what he says? There's no reason not to trust him other than you want to save Joseph's reputation.
It sounds really bad to say. Well, literally how she paints it is like Hiram telling Joseph, well, Joseph, try to have a revelation about this because Emma is still resisting this. So here, let's put a revelation down.
Jen?
Yeah. Like just think of that in your head for a second. William Clayton comes to Joseph. He's like, Joseph, buddy, Emma's still not having it. She's upset. She doesn't like it. She's not going to go along with this. You need to do something. You need to make a revelation. You need to make a revelation, maybe have a flaming sword in there. No, I'm adding my own words now, but he did. He comes to Joseph and says, Emma's not having it. She doesn't agree with this.
It was Hiram, right? Was it Hiram?
Yeah.
Coming to Joseph?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. And it's just,
because didn't Joseph send Hiram to Emma to try and make Emma okay with it? Because Joseph was afraid to tell Emma himself.
Yeah.
yes.
Isn't that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Hiram comes back and
And he's like, no, she's not having it, Joseph.
and William's just writing it down.
You got to do, yeah, William's writing it down. You got to do something else, Joseph. It has to be a revelation from God, or
Mhm.
she is not going to be okay.
And I think even after she gets to a revelation, doesn't the story go that she destroys it, or she says like, no, I'm still not going to accept this.
Yeah, so and the question is, did she get Joseph to throw it in the fire and destroy it? So there's a story to that effect.
Mhm.
And so then the question would be, well, then how do they have a copy of it? Well, it was supposedly copied before it was taken to Emma. And so then I guess Joseph could be magnanimous and say, oh, well, dear, if you don't approve, I'd just throw it in the fire. We're done. Who knows what happened as far as what happened in the room when the two of them were just there. But obviously a copy had been left in the office, and that's how we got to have the one that's in the Doctrine and Covenants. And we can see that it fits what we know of the time period, that it's not a later invented revelation, because it has phrasing in different people's accusations and things that are later in the Nauvoo Expositor. There's echoes of things in the Revelation that I think you can build a case that we have what he wrote.
Yeah.
So,
And again, somebody said they don't like us invoking Occam's razor, but again, I'm going to ask my viewers and listeners, what's more likely? That Joseph Smith had been busted for adultery before, that he has 22 wives without getting Emma's consent. He's been lying to her and the whole church about it. He sends Hiram to go try and convince Emma to be okay with it. She says no. And he comes back and says, Joseph, she's not having it. You better come up with the revelation. That, or God just happened to coincidentally, God who's a God of order, God who's a God of structure, just happens to then come up with a revelation 22 wives in to Joseph Smith's polygamy.
Yeah.
What's
Right.
more likely?
Well, and then maybe she's ignoring or not mentioning the fact. Well, actually, definitely ignores it because they don't mention it and they don't talk about it. That a third of this revelation is directed to Emma and threatening her with destruction.
Exactly. Yeah. Why was that important? Why in the world would that have been an important theme, that Emma's going to be destroyed?
yes.
Yeah, that's a great point, Gerardo.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's
what number was Emma? She was 23.
22 or 23, something
Yeah,
like that.
22 or 23.
Violating the law.
That
Sarah.
was never,
Yeah.
that was something new that I learned
Yeah.
just actually a few months ago, I think.
Yeah.
That she was really far down the line in Joseph being sold to her.
Yeah.
I really like Kate Holbrook, her demeanor. She seems kind. She seems sincere, heartfelt, but this is really deceptive. And I don't even think she probably realizes.
Yeah.
No,
how
it's your
deceptive she's
training.
being.
You're set up this way your whole life to put this filter on that filters out negative thoughts about Joseph and only lets the positive ones through.
She's like, I'm not 100% convinced that,
I-
That's the story.
yeah. Yeah. Okay. This is important. This is all really important stuff. So anyway, can't trust Clayton.
yeah.
All right. Can't trust Clayton. Okay. So next quote. This is about how you can't trust memories that are too far removed. So here we go.
Yeah. And Kate, will you correct this if I'm wrong? Because I love being corrected, actually. But a lot of what we know about Nauvoo doesn't come till decades later when people are talking about it finally in the 60s, 70s. And I, as a historian, I'm not a historian, but as a historian, as I'm trying to be a historian, aren't I supposed to be a little bit more careful with memories that are 20, 30 years after the fact than I am with maybe a contemporary source? Can you talk about that just a little bit, that what we know about polygamy maybe comes from these later sources that, as much as people, I don't think they're lying. I just think that memories can change over time.
Yes, that's absolutely true, Hank. Our best friends our best tools as historians are things that are written at the really close to the time something happened.
Jen, you were raising your hand.
When I watched this, the first thing that popped into my mind was, if we're going to use that same rule that he was talking about, then we should also accept the first vision account of Joseph Smith.
Because it says,
Because it says he saw God.
no, the Lord.
Yeah.
The Lord. Yeah, the Lord. One person.
Yeah.
He saw one person when he went into the grove to pray. So it seems like they use it when they want to, and then they don't use that same logic when it doesn't fit into their narrative. So that was disturbing.
That's a great point. Yeah.
Because the one that's canonized is literally 18 years later.
Later.
than the-
1838. Right?
Yeah, yeah.
So the official first version is about 20 years after it actually happened.
Right.
Right.
And not the first
And
one.
Hank Smith says we
Yeah.
should trust the first one.
Yeah.
Hmm.
The closest one that happened.
Yeah.
Sandra, what are Hank Smith and Kate Holbrook doing here when they're talking about later accounts are less credible? What are they trying to do?
Well, they're trying to make it appear that we don't know anything about this stuff until way after Joseph's death. But we do have sources at the time. I mean, you've got Bennett's book, you have the Nauvoo Expositor, you have
Well, she's William Law,
William
who was
Law,
Joseph's assistant or co-president or first
right,
presidency
right,
member.
who
Yeah.
leaves over polygamy,
Yeah.
and Clayton, faithful Mormon all his life. He's got polygamy stuff in his journal. He is not a person trying to discredit Joseph. He's a full believer.
It just happens that it matches what everyone else is saying.
So it's just amazing when they want to pick something that's a later reference. If it suits them, then they want to use it. But if someone else brings it up, that, oh, well, that's a late memory. I mean, granted, you want to get as close to the event as possible in what you have of sources, but because it's a late source in and of itself does not mean it is not true or not reliable. You look for supporting evidences around the statement. And I mean, the reorganized church tried for years to dismiss polygamy on that kind of logic. But the evidence is there that we know there was polygamy. We know Joseph Smith slept with different women. We know he slept with, I think Brian Hales admits to something like 9 of the women having been consummated. Well, why should I assume that it wasn't any more than 9? I mean, what would be the problem with it being more than 9? I don't know why they even have a problem with this, but so you have to weigh out the sources. Just because it's late, it can still be reliable. And maybe it's not reliable, but we have enough evidence on polygamy to show that really was the case in the situation that was going on. And they know that.
I just wonder how many things of William Clayton does the church rely on as an important part of its history,
Right.
such that William Clayton is legitimate source when it
Yes.
buttresses the church, but he's an illegitimate choice or source
I
when
think
he's saying something inconvenient,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Well, the
'Cause he was a
biggest
scribe about more things than just
right.
Polygamy. Well,
right?
right. Right.
Like, is a Book of Abraham? Wasn't he a Book of Abraham? No. Anyway, I don't want to.
But he had diaries. He had different accounts of things that
Yeah.
they would rely on.
Yeah.
I need a break.
Okay. Go ahead. And what we'll
You
do
guys
is
can continue.
we'll go ahead and play the next clip,
Yeah.
and then Sandra, you come right back as soon as you're ready, and we'll incorporate Sandra back in. Okay, the very next clip, we're going to go ahead and roll. Here we go. The next clip. John, by the way, is going to give us some wisdom.
And it doesn't, I mean, I believe those people would want us to be honest. It doesn't mean we whitewash anything, but it does mean that we approach this with empathy and respect for their.
Okay, really quick, let me give it a little precursor. So, by the way, before this point, sort of makes the point that that we need to use our faith when the history doesn't add up. So that's the first thing that we didn't hear is, by the way, saying, hey, whenever the history doesn't add up, use your faith. And then Holbrook goes on to tell a story about Richard Bushman, where Richard Bushman says we should write history where if we end up meeting the person in the afterlife,
Mhm.
they would be happy with what we wrote. So that's the precursor to what Kate Holbrook is about to say. So
Yeah.
that's just setting up the context a little
Yeah.
bit. Okay, so here's now the actual follow-up.
And it doesn't, I mean, I believe those people would want us to be honest. It doesn't mean we whitewash anything, but it does mean that we approach this with empathy and respect
Yeah.
for their humanity.
Beautiful.
Mm. Oh, that is so well said. I tell my students, I get my medical advice from trained doctors, I get my dental advice from trained dentists, and I get my history from trained historians. Not everyone is a historian, despite what the internet tells you. Not everyone is a historian. Just because they have a source doesn't mean that they've done the work.
Gerardo, you liked that quote from Hank Smith. What do you want to say about that? He gets his history from trained historians, so case closed.
Yeah, is he really considering all trained historians or just the one he likes?
Yeah.
The ones that are actually, I mean, it's hard not to say that they're whitewashing the history. Like when you listen to Kate telling the story, it's hard not to say that she's not whitewashing it and trying to make Joseph come out squeaky clean of all this whole thing. So yeah, it's hard. So when Hank Smith says like he gets his history from trained historians, that's interesting because most of these arguments about polygamy and how Joseph didn't have sex with most of his wives and how he didn't have sex with the polyandrous wives, most of these arguments that Kay uses come from Brian Hales, who's not a trained historian.
That's a good point.
And-
he's an anesthetologist.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And anesthesiologist.
Anesthesiologist.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the actual trained historians like Michael Quinn, like Dan Vogel,
Von Brody.
who have fought and actually had interactions with Brian Hales, telling him like, no, Joseph did have sex with his polyandrous wives. It seems like Hank Smith is not talking about them, not acknowledging them. He'll give more credit probably if you ask him to Brian Hales.
Yeah. And of course they're going to say, well, Richard Bushman is a trained historian. He went to Harvard and
But
he taught at
I don't think he
Columbia.
says no. I don't think he has the same arguments as Brian Hales, Richard Bushman. He probably just he just avoids the subject as much as he can, I think.
Yeah, but he does cover it a little bit in Rough Stone Rolling. But the only point I want to make there is he is biased. Like he has been a stake president. He's been a patriarch, and he basically was commissioned to write that book, as we know now through Hans Matson. The church commissioned him to write Rough Stone Rolling. So it's kind of like trusting a pharmaceutical company who ran a study claiming that the drugs are healthy. Like you can't trust the producer of the biased producer of the drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Bushman is a great historian, but he is probably the least credible because of his admitted bias. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, I think so. And Sandra's back in the house, which is good. Sandra, it's always better when you're here.
Wait a minute.
Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and go on to the next point where they're going to read a quote from Brittany Nash about from a book called Let's Talk About Plural Marriage that we'll include in the show notes. So here we go.
With Brittany, she says, when I first began my journey studying polygamy, I was angry by what I saw as an injustice that God required such a difficult principle to be lived by these faithful, tried people. But as I studied the personal writing, stories, and testimonies of polygamists, accepting them on their own terms, that's a lot what Kate just mentioned, she says, I found peace. The practice could have never been sustained for a half century by compulsion, manipulation, or simple sexual desire. Those who set the foundation of the Latter-day Saint faith were not two-dimensional superheroes, as they are sometimes portrayed, but they were complex, strong, intelligent, full-bodied kingdom builders who are willing to leave loved ones, wealth, comfort, and native countries for what they believe to be true. This same willingness drove them to accept polygamy, a practice they accepted as a commandment of God instituted in their time for his unique purposes. And I'll finish here. I have since come to view plural marriage as part of the Latter-day Saint history to unapologetically own and to hold as one of the most valuable testaments of the faith in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I love that.
Boy, she should
so
be a
glad
writer.
You shared that, Hank.
Yeah.
She is a writer, and she's a great researcher, and she worked on this for a long, long time. You can trust the work she did on that
Yeah,
book.
well, you sold me. That is a beautiful way to put it. And to go to original sources, what did the people involved actually say? I'm so appreciative of that kind of a thing. Instead of all of us judging this, decades later, looking back and making our own judgments. So that's a great one, Hank.
That's Brittany Nash, and you can listen to her podcast with Morgan Jones on All In, or you can pick up the book, Let's Talk About Polygamy, or Let's Talk About Plural Marriage. I think it's one or the other. And I will say this too, John, you bring up a great statement in my mind from McLean Heward. Do you remember Dr. Heward when he came on way back, section 40
Yes.
or something, back when we were brand new at this? And he said, please stop being offended on their behalf and start being inspired by them. I've always remembered that. Stop being offended on their behalf and be inspired by these people. Read their stories. Read what they actually have to say. All right. John and I have taken over too long. Kate, let's go back to you and let you take over.
No, Hank, but your that important quotation you just read also reminds me of our brothers and sisters of color say that same thing to white people who want to do the right thing, but then end up making up things that are a little off the mark or defending them in ways that don't feel true to them. The brothers and sisters of color, it's the same thing. Listen to them, listen to their voices, listen to their stories, their testimonies.
Absolutely.
So Sandra, what's wrong with that argument? The women bore testimony that polygamy was awesome. We need to listen to their testimonies. And then I'm going to ask you, Jen, after. What's wrong with that argument? We should just believe the women who said polygamy was amazing.
Well, I'd like to know how the stacks would be of statements by women that thought it was wonderful with the statements that said it wasn't. Clearly, there were a lot of women that did not have happy marriages in plural marriage. I mean, I could look at the pioneers and appreciate their commitment and their zeal, their accomplishments in building the West. But that doesn't mean you have to say that the religious practices they were going through were something to be admired or something to be happy about. I know in my own family, there are records of my ancestors not being happy with polygamy. So we'll look at the polygamous groups. There are plenty of women that have suffered terribly in those different polygamous groups. Then there are those that would say it's wonderful, but I end up wondering how many say it's wonderful because they're still in it and aren't able to leave it. It's a very sad heritage that we have in polygamy. I mean, we can love our grandparents, great-grandparents that were all stuck in a horrible situation and have loving thoughts of them, but that doesn't prove what they were practicing was true. If you have a Muslim family that's practicing polygamy, they may have wonderful stories of how it works for them, but I think that you would also find a lot of the Muslim women that feel polygamy is a very great burden on them in their country, wherever they're living. So I don't think it's a convincing argument to say that some women could say, I had a good life as a polygamist wife.
Yeah. Jen, really quick, I want to hear your view on why it's not enough necessarily to just believe the women who said polygamy was awesome.
Yeah, so I have a cousin that's polygamist and well, a few cousins and an uncle, an aunt. And I think if I asked them, they would definitely tell me that they're happy and that they are living it. I know some of them are public with it. I don't know them personally, but the stories that I hear, they're happy where they are. But I also know that they're very isolated within their group, and that don't really have the life experience to make a educated, um, I don't know, an
Informed.
educated, informed decision on that. Um, because they only know one thing. They only know one thing. And then you hear stories. You just can't do that. You just can't get one story or one person's view and then everyone else is that same way. If you look into, the wives that kept journals, or you look into the stories, and you read, um, and learn from them, you just know that's not true. You know that they weren't all happy, and
Yeah.
it wasn't all okay, and it wasn't all happiness, and the picture that's painted for us within the church, it just isn't so.
It reminds me a lot of stories of in the South of owners trying to say, my slaves are all happy. It's a wonderful system. Well, there probably were some farms where the people were well treated, but to be a slave is never the end product of what you would want for your life. So even if their life was well cared for, they still were slaves. And the same with these polygamous wives. Some may have been happy, but they were stuck in situations that you're out here in Utah on some farm out in the middle of nowhere. What are your options? A lot of women were just plain stuck.
I'm pretty sure Rod Meldrum tried to make the argument that there are accounts of black slaves
That we're happy.
that were happy in their slavery in the South before
Yeah.
slavery was abolished. Yeah, that's not really compelling. There's some other quotes like Chris Murphy says, "Why do women stay in bad marriages?"
Mm.
It's very common for victims of abuse to say that their abusers are good people. I mean, that's very, very common.
Yeah.
And Gerardo, I want to come to you. Just one quick thing. I'll make the other point that, do you think the wives of Warren Jeffs believe that they were happy? Do we believe them? If is it good because the wives of Warren Jeffs say that it's happy? If the wives of Keith Raniere of Nexium,
Right.
or the plural, the people he's sleeping with, if they say that it's good, is it good? If Jim Jones women that he slept with say it's good, is it good? David Koresh's women, I think we've
Or
made that
followers,
point.
yeah.
Like
Yeah.
lots of followers of cults. If you watch any cult, go watch Wild Wild Country on Netflix. Go watch Holy Hell on Netflix. Watch any cult and watch The Vow. Anyone is going to say, unless they were like severely abused, the happiest time of my life was being in the cult. So just testifying that you're happy literally means nothing, I think,
Yeah.
unless you're going to then grant all the other cult followers that it must have been true for them too. Right?
Yeah.
Yep. And I think a good way to judge, so it's hard because then we're in there's the argument of then when can we trust people that people know better, or that people know, when can we trust people, as when is it okay to say, okay, I'm going to trust this person, is okay, but not this one? And I think a good way for me to do it would be just studying what are the factors of that play into undue influence. And if any of those factors, like if there's not informed consent, if there are being, just if they're using the bite model, if they're, being cornered into situations like this, if that's their whole worldview, then there's a good way in which we can judge, if the system is good, that maybe would be better than just trusting anyone that says that there's the system that they're in is amazing.
Also, if they're sincere believers in DNC 132, if they've read it, and if all their friends and family are devout Mormons, what are the consequences of them saying, yeah, my marriage to Joseph was awful?
Yeah.
Like how, well, you know, what would that have been like for them to say, yeah, I was married to Joseph. He was horrible to me. It was terrible. I hated polygamy. And then all your family disowns you and they smear you and they run you into the mud.
Yeah.
Could they even have said what they really thought?
And not only in this life, but in the eternities. Like
Yeah.
that'd be damning to their whole
Salvation.
eternal existence. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let me give you a Brigham Young example. So he gets up one day in conference and says, okay, this is it. As of such and such a date, all the women better shut up and shape up. And if you don't stop complaining on that date, I'm going to set you all free. You're going to be divorced. And so,
Yeah, that's good.
I'm going to just, that's it. Anyone's complaining, you're out of the church, you're out of your family, you're gone. That's, it's over. Well, years later, Mary Ann Angel, his first wife and my great-great-grandma, she left a statement saying, if God doesn't recompense us for all the agony and sorrow we've had through polygamy, there's no justice. Now, that's a paraphrase. I don't remember exactly how the words go, but that's the sentiment. I mean, she doesn't end her life sounding like, oh, yay, this was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. I liked sharing my husband with 50 other women. No, she says there's no justice if God doesn't make up to her all this pain.
And why, by the way, why is he saying that if everybody's loving polygamy?
Yeah.
Why is,
why is Brigham going to ship them all out?
Good point.
so we have a viewer, Chris Murphy's asking for that quote. So
I would
we'll
have
put it in
to,
the show notes.
I have to get it for you.
Okay. So Jen, make a note of that if you can for this, or Jennifer, when she does the show notes, we'll have her take a note of that. Yeah. And so Jen, I just want to say you gave this heartfelt sort of like protestation of how hurtful polygamy was. And what they're saying here is, Jen Camp, stop being offended on their behalf and start being inspired.
Inspired to out everything that they are trying to cover up. Like, no, we're not. No. Sorry, I will disagree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's continue. And there's still more. Let's go to the next clip.
Oh my goodness. There's so much.
Let's keep going.
If we look in verse 40, again, we have that mention of I give unto thee my servant Joseph an appointment and restore all things. So again, we're being reminded that this is a restoration. Just an important thing to remember. And we have all of these verses about adultery and when what somebody thinks might be plural marriage isn't plural marriage. It's actually adultery. And some for those listeners, for those people out there who will read this carefully, you'll see a little bit of contradiction. You'll see that what it says here isn't how it always played out in Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage. And so then again, I think we need to go back down here to verse 66 at the end. And now, as pertaining to this law, verily, verily, I say unto you, I will reveal more unto you hereafter. So that's not only a sentence for us, it was a sentence for Joseph Smith himself. And it was a sentence for the saints as life in Nauvoo wrapped up and they traveled west and they kept staying with this principle in Utah, and plural marriage looked different then than it did in Nauvoo. And then in 1890, when Wilford Woodruff announced that there should be an end to plural marriage, that was very devastating for a lot of saints who had sacrificed so much for this principle, and they felt not only the sacrifice, but they just felt it was a key thing that set them apart and was a crucial part of their testimony to hear the prophet, whom they would honor because these were Orthodox believers, say that this will no longer be a part of our system. That was a whole new trial. So continuing revelation, or the way it says in here, I will reveal more unto you. That's another really important thing to keep in mind in studying both this section and the practice of plural marriage.
What a
Can I-
turnaround. That's such a fascinating turnaround. Is it
Yeah.
so hard to accept and then so hard to let go of?
leave. I see. I'd never thought of that. I thought they'd be phew, glad that's over, but it's more like, but wait, these are our families. These are our relationships. We have a testimony of it. Interesting.
Yeah.
How about it is good to be the king? How about that for why they didn't want to give it up? Like, what do you make of their argument?
I
Sarah.
see people that had sacrificed so much for this. Remember, many of them had been in hiding so they wouldn't get arrested. Some had gone to prison because of polygamy. And I can just see them thinking, well, what was all of that about? What was the last 30 years of my life about?
Yeah.
Running from the law, sacrificing everything, hiding away maybe from my family. So to me, it's that they're looking back on horrible things they went through to live the principle. And then just like that, click of a finger, turn around. Oh, sorry, guys, it's all over now. It's like when I think of the two girls that the Partridge Girls, that when he calls them into the parlor after Emma's given him such a fit about him, and he brings them in and he says to them, well, sorry, girls, it's all over. Emma's mad, so you'll have to move out. And they're like, what? It's just, when you've made these kind of sacrifices, how do you keep believing when you have this kind of betrayal of the sacrifices they've asked of you, and to trivialize it, to just turn around and say, oh, oops, we're not going to do it anymore. I don't know. It's hard either way, but it would be very confusing to suddenly just say, well, yeah, the last 50 years don't count, or 40 years, sorry about that. We're giving it all up. It would be devastating.
Yeah.
John Sawyer writes, the continuing revelation card trumps all other cards, unfortunately. The church can always fall back on that.
Yes.
Whenever there's a change, even if it's a reversal, it's all revelation.
Yeah.
The November 15 policy was revelation when it was given. And then when it's reversed 4 years later, that's also revelation. The house always wins, as Kara has said before. Also, both Elisa and Donnell both write sunk cost fallacy, that once you've committed and dedicated so much time and your reputation, so many sacrifices, you're actually inclined to justify and conclude that it was a good thing.
Right.
Mhm.
This is one phrase that I do not like that believing members use, which I used when I was also a believing member. I can't remember who was saying it in the video just then, but if you don't understand it, if it's not feeling right to you, if something's telling you something is off, don't worry. It'll all be okay in the hereafter. Like, it'll all make sense in the afterlife. Like, it'll be better then. You'll get all your blessings that, you're not seeing come true in your patriarchal blessing. Don't worry. You'll get them in the afterlife. Like, that's what they meant in that. Like, there's so many ways that they use that phrase when they can't explain something or don't want to say the truth of it. And I just disagree with that saying that they said in that clip.
Yeah. And we're actually going to show a clip of Elder Holland saying just that in just a few minutes. So
Okay.
you're a prophetess. Okay. Go ahead.
There was a point. I mean, let's give her kudos for admitting that the instructions laid out on DC 132 did not always apply to Joseph. She tried to justify it by saying, well, it's because here in the Revelation, it also says that God is going to reveal him more. So maybe that's why he got permission to violate all these rules that God laid out. I don't know. But I mean, at least she's admitting that members are going to see a contradiction between what Doctrine and Covenants 132 says and how Joseph practiced polygamy.
Yeah. When was D&C 132 ever really followed? Because she's saying it wasn't followed later. It certainly wasn't followed when Joel was alive.
Yeah.
When was it followed?
Wow.
Seriously.
I don't
Anybody
think
know?
it was.
It was never followed.
It was never done the
don't
way
think it
it's
was.
written.
Mm-mm.
I mean, didn't you say it didn't even get published in the Doctrine and Covenants until like the
1876.
so it wasn't even canonized until 1876.
Yeah,
And then they end it by they don't end it in 1890. They claim
to end
to
it.
end it in 1890, and then they lied and
They
kept practicing.
advised the members to quit practicing it.
All right. Here's one of the biggest whoppers of the whole thing, Gerardo. I'm going to have you comment on this first. This is just a whopper of all whoppers, and I'm just going to play it.
Kate, I think, and I want to ask this correctly. I think on our listeners' mind might be the fear that Joseph or Brigham is using this to get that they want. Is there anything in the historical record that says Joseph and Brigham or any others were this didn't think this was from God? They knew it wasn't from God, and they were just kind of sneaking in something because they knew the people would buy it. I want to calm that fear coming from anyone. Is there anything in the history that says they were trying to pull the wool over someone's eyes?
Good. No, no. I mean, nothing in any letter. Nothing. It's very clear to me that this was something that they believed God didn't just want, but commanded them to do. And also, Kathleen Flake is the one who first mentioned this perspective, so I'm roughly quoting her. But there are a lot easier ways to have extramarital sex or to have sex with a lot of women than to marry them. You know,
and be
I hope that's
responsible
not
for the offspring and everything.
Too coarse, but
Yeah.
and to invent this elaborate. There are plenty of other religious leaders, not Latter-day Saints, who also had vibrant sexual lives. They did not. They just did it.
There's no theology.
There was no theology. There was no revelation. There was no explanation and bringing people in carefully and telling them to go and pray about it. There was none of that. This is an exceptional situation. This does not look like those other cases.
I think that's important to. Thank you, Kate. I think that was very important to for people that just kind of calm their fears a little bit. That Joseph isn't the man they thought he was. Right.
Gerardo, what do you think?
Well, that's a lie. I mean, I know the word lie is harsh, but
What's
that's a lie.
What's
Like
a lie?
where Kate is saying that it's unprecedented how Joseph came up with all this theology around polygamy. So we can't believe that it was just for sex because there was so much theology around it.
He was drowning in theology.
and that no unprecedented there's no other person in history or cult leader has ever done this before. So Joseph is an exception. That's what she says. It's a lie. And Jonathan Streeter on that video that I keep talking about, 2 years ago he completely debunks Kate's point, and he gives really good examples of different cult leaders who literally come up with theology around why they needed to practice polygamy or other kinds of like sex with other women and stuff. So yeah, that's a misrepresentation. And then another misrepresentation is when she says that there's nothing in the historical record that says that Joseph was just trying to have sex, which or like lie or not being truthful about this being from God. I mean, there's so much out there. Like we already covered it. Like Fanny Alger, like that was an affair. We have Sarah Pratt. We have, even Nancy Rigdon. We have John C. Bennett and the people that were involved with him. We have the Nauvoo expositor. Like
his denials to Emma, his denials to the church. Okay.
We have literally what's his name? Sorry. William McClellan, who says that Emma admitted to him that Joseph had a full-on affair with Fanny Alger, and not only with Fanny Alger, but with also someone called he says Miss Hill. So he had 2 affairs, around Fanny Alger's time. So I mean, there's so much out there.
Plus Emma's denials. But
Yeah.
Gerardo, so I agree with that there's so much evidence that shows that it was sketchy, that he knew he was doing something wrong. But maybe there's another way to look at it. And this is just me playing devil's advocate. What if what she's saying is, yes, he lied about it or didn't tell Emma or the Fanny Alger thing, but I think she was saying there's no evidence where he admits it's an intentional fraud. In other words, she believes that in his mind, he believed it was approved of by God. And there's nothing to suggest, because also Dan Vogel makes this point, the pious fraud point, which is that Joseph believed that God was okay with righteous lies, like deceiving people about Laban and killing Laban, if there's a greater purpose. So I think she was making the point, not that there isn't problems with the narrative, but that there's no evidence that Joseph believed he was lying. She believes that that all the evidence points, or there's a lack of evidence refuting the idea, to refute the idea that Joseph was sincere, believing his polygamy was of God. Sandra, what do you think?
Well, that may be true in Nauvoo, but it's not true for Fanny. He's not putting out a religious argument on her. It's just plain meeting her in the barn and getting caught. There's no evidence there was religious talk involved in this, but it's the same as
But she would say there's no evidence that there's not. So how do we know that Joseph didn't bring Fanny into the barn, tell her about the revelation, and say, hey, I've got this angel. The angel's hanging over me, Fanny. We got to do this because, like, the angel.
Well,
like she said, there's no evidence that wasn't happening.
Do we have evidence that David Koresh or any of these other guys fully believed or didn't believe? I mean, they always said they believed. So, but how do you know if they didn't believe? I mean, it's a silly argument, because you could make it of any group that had one of these leaders that insisted on his own way with women in his group.
And another issue is that Joseph's theology, by this point, the historians are able to prove or talk about how Joseph's internal beliefs were so expansive by this point that anything went. So by this point, Joseph has a view that anything that he wanted, God would give to him. And he didn't really have to have God's permission because he was the anointed.
But I think you're making Kate's point,
right?
Which is that he just felt God was okay with anything he did.
Yeah.
If he felt good about it, God was okay with it.
But how do we know? Well, I mean, it's like Sandra is saying, how are we able to test
faith? And they would say faith. Jen, you need faith.
But then he had a rule, remember? Everyone forgets about the rule.
The order.
The structure.
There was a rule and structure. Remember when he made this? Like, rule and structure. And Joseph didn't follow the rules and structures. So, like, it doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense, that argument.
Yeah. What about the argument that there are easier ways to have sex, Sandra? It's true. You just go have sex. You don't need to create a theology around it.
Well, obviously you don't need to, because he did it with Fanny Alger without a doctorate.
That's exactly what I would say. That's exactly what I would say.
But
without a theology. And he married 22 women without a theology, right?
Yeah.
Before Emma.
Breaking the rule because he didn't ask Emma about them.
Yeah.
Well, and these were not marriages. I mean, the Mormons want to keep talking about it like it was some sort of legitimate thing, that they were truly married. They weren't married.
Right.
It was adulterous affairs. It wasn't recognized by anyone in the community as legal. They weren't presented as legal wives, and he didn't support them.
Right.
He didn't have 22 women living at his house. Well, at least we don't know that he had that many, but he had some women living there. But it really was not setting up a household or living polygamy as a community would do in the homes, like they did later in Utah, which she kind of is conceding when she was saying, well, it's a little messy in Nauvoo and they did it a little different out here in Utah. Yes, when it got down to practical stuff, it was kind of hard to get all that to work. And so they made some changes in how they did it. Makes you wonder what Joseph thought it would be going forward if he had lived. Did he really think he was going to support all these women? Uh, oh, maybe he's expecting a big raise from the church, but I mean, how would you support that many women?
Yeah. And I think what they're trying to do is put the burden on us, the critics, to prove that it was false. And I don't think the burden is on us to prove this false. I don't think we should be talking about this, oh, this is actually from God, or no, this was actually, we're presenting the evidence, we're giving the actual context of what they're talking about, and then people can decide whether or not they want to believe in this God that allows all this kind of
Yeah.
messy things to happen.
Yeah. Definitely. David Willis writes, it's impossible to prove a negative. There's another common quote, which is the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And so just the fact that no one can provide evidence of Joseph having sex, or like a videotape, or nobody can find evidence that Joseph believed it was a fraud, that doesn't mean there weren't, there wasn't evidence. Right.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, we've already talked about Helen Mar Kimball, but they actually want to weigh in. They're going to weigh in on Helen Mar Kimball. Are you ready, Jen? You excited?
Maybe.
You excited for this? All right, this is why Helen Mar Kimball was okay. Why 14-year-old was okay. Here we go.
So Helen Mar Kimball was 14 when she married Joseph Smith. And some of us want to think, people regularly got married at age 14 back then. Well, that was young back then. It wasn't unheard of and it was legal, but it was young. Joseph Smith didn't approach Helen Mar Kimball. Helen Mar Kimball's father approached Joseph Smith because he wanted, through his daughter, for his family to be sealed to Joseph Smith. And there's an article on this by Spencer Fluman. It's available online. Yeah, and it's terrific. So I highly recommend that for anybody who wants to look closely into this. And the theology, my husband, Sam Brown, has written a lot about this in different venues, including a book called In Heaven as It Is on Earth. But it helps explain why the plural marriage, it sometimes involved sex. And with Helen Mar Kimball, we have her reminiscences about plural marriage. We have actually a lot of records about her, which is great because she was so young that she's the one that troubles us the most. She never mentioned there was a sexual component to this marriage. But we do know she suffered on account of it because she lost her hopes for romance and, all those things a teenager has of who am I going to marry and what will my wedding be like and all of that. That was all gone for her. And she stayed. She lived for decades. She lived to be an old woman, and she stayed faithful to the church the whole time, which I think helps, which I think is an important context for that union.
When we hear these people, see them.
Yes.
See her whole story.
She didn't run screaming. And
So Jen, she never wrote down, Helen Mar Kimball never wrote down Joseph and I had sex, and she stayed faithful, and she didn't run away screaming. So is that okay?
No.
What's wrong with the art? So let's take each one. She never wrote it down. Helen Mar Kimball never wrote down, hey, everyone. Hey, posterity. Joseph Smith and I had sex. She didn't do that.
Who cares? Like, that's not,
Well,
that's not it. For me, that's not even an important factor. Like,
Do you know I'm 52 and I've never written on a piece of paper, Margie and I had sex? Not one time. And I'm 52.
because because
It's
and
on a
why I
podcast.
say that, is
It's on a
because
podcast now,
because it shouldn't ever have been an issue. Like, it shouldn't ever have been.
Yeah.
She shouldn't ever have been put in that position to where she would even have to, like, someone would question a 14-year-old about writing down or telling or even talking about anything sexual in that time and day.
Yeah.
Like, it just wouldn't happen. She shouldn't be asked historically or when she was alive to do that, to even think about doing that. It's just it wouldn't happen. And if you read her journals and you can feel her heart being shattered and like um torn apart on the pages. And as like you just see her longing to just be a kid, she did not want to be in this relationship. Like they had, and there wasn't a lack of boys her age. There in her journal, she writes, quoting from her journal, during the winter of 1843, there were plenty of parties and balls. Some of the young gentlemen got up a series of dancing parties to be held at the mansion once a week. I had to stay home as my father had been warned by the prophet to keep his daughter away from there. And then she longs, for no girl loved dancing better than I, and I really felt that it was too much to bear. I long for the freedom that was denied me. Like, feel that. Feel that. Don't care. I don't care if she didn't write down she had sex with Joseph or not. Like, it just tears my heart apart as a mother and as a woman. There was no reason for him to marry her. None. He could have sealed that family together without Helen. Like, you're the prophet, right? You're the king. Go do it. Go do it and leave the young girl who wanted to be a young girl alone.
Yeah. And it's worse because, like, I think about all the victims of sexual abuse, all the victims of childhood sexual abuse that we've had on Mormon Stories. And can you imagine saying to them, why didn't you run screaming?
Yeah.
Like, why don't children run screaming from their sexual predators?
I'll tell you why. Because they're scared, and because they're threatened, and because they're in fear. They're in fear of their life and their family's life. And they're told not to by people who are in authority above them. And that is why. So don't ever ask a victim why they didn't tell, why they didn't say anything. There's many, many, many reasons why they didn't say anything. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the reason they didn't say anything. What matters is that they're a victim. And that's what matters.
And that-
I would just say to anyone that's a church going person, when you're at church next week, just look around at the 14-year-old girls in your congregation and imagine an older gentleman coming to you and wanting to take your daughter into a marriage relationship. But it's not going to be legal. It's not going to be public. It's not going to be authorized by the community. It's something she will have to live with in secret and never talk to anyone about. And tell me that 14-year-old girl looks ready for that.
yeah.
And she's telling you in her own words, she's not ready. She's not.
Yeah.
She told her mother that. She told her father that. She's not. And it's not okay. And it shouldn't have happened. And they act like, oh, but everyone had grand spiritual experiences and they all loved it. And it was all happiness and everything. No, it wasn't. It wasn't. And you need to stop saying it.
Yeah. And to rely on this idea that she never wrote it down just ignores the fact that how many childhood victims never tell
Right.
about their abuse or don't tell about it until they're adults.
Right.
You know, that's almost all.
Yeah.
Almost all childhood sexual abuse goes unreported. So it's the norm for it to be reported. You know, not the exception. Gerardo?
I mean, there's so much context around the Joseph Smith marrying Helen Mar Kimball. I'll give some of this, some of it. I did want to say one of the reasons why apologists and the church wants to claim that Helen Mar Kimball was just so faithful and like never had a problem with it is because later on her life, once she was when she moved on, after Joseph died, she became a very vocal advocate of polygamy and became really judgy of the people who complained about polygamy. So her later writings reflect that, and like a very, very strong advocate and believer of the faith and polygamy and all that. And that's where most apologists and the church want to say, well, look at how she ended up, like thinking about this stuff. But as Jen brought up, well, that was way different what she was thinking when she was 14, and then so around
Also, how many sexual abuse victims stay Mormon?
right
A gazillion,
yeah.
right? Okay, keep going.
So there was this story. So before, when Helen was around 9 years old, Heber was being sent into missions a lot, and I think it was during one of his missions he sent his Helen 2 China dolls, and one time Joseph came into the Kimball's home and picked up one of the dolls, took her head off, and said, "As that has fallen, so as the heathens God shall fall." It's just like an interesting interaction of Joseph with Helen, breaking her doll. And Helen says like she didn't understand what all that was about. And that was kind of weird. But anyway, in 1843, then Kimball is in on the secret happenings of Nauvoo. And Todd Compton talks about how in 1842 Joseph approaches Kimball and says, "Hey, I need to marry your wife." And that's when, Kimball and his wife go and pray about it for like 3 days. And then they come back and say, "Okay, Joseph, yeah, you can take my wife." But then Joseph said, "Oh, that was just an Abrahamic test." And then it is thought, Lindsay Hansen Park says that it was after that then Joseph asked for Helen. And then Heber goes and talks to Helen and, has him, tries to convince her to accept polygamy. But by this point, Heber also had already married another wife, Sarah Peake.
You mean Heber C. Kimball,
Yeah,
right?
sorry,
Okay.
Heber C. Kimball.
Okay. I just want to make sure I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. And she was a convert from England, and she had 2 children, and then Heber had another child with her. So there was definitely like sex going on between, Heber C. Kimball and his plural wife, which when Joseph proposes marrying Helen, that's why I think in my mind, that's why the mom was so devastated, because she knew what it meant. Like it was not just something on paper or for Helen also wrote a poem later on where she says that originally she thought that the marriage was going to be for eternity alone, but then she later found out that it was for time and eternity, which usually that's code for sex. And that's a poem Helen wrote. Just all interesting context around the whole marriage thing.
I just had an ex-Mormon revelation. The most damaging thing that could probably ever be done to the church would be for someone to do a documentary or a biopic on Helen Mar Kimball.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just do a movie on the life of Helen Mar Kimball.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I don't, yeah, exactly. And that will blow up their whole narrative. And I don't like how in the clip that we just saw that they are, I just lost my train of thought. Give me 1 sec.
No worries at all. Like I think about, man, someday Hulu or HBO or Amazon, everyone wants kind of the Joseph Smith documentary of like Joseph Smith's life overall. Just skip Joseph and go to Helen.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
and Jen, as soon as you come up with that thought, just jump right back in. I know it's
Well,
gonna
one
hit
of
you.
the things that she said too is like, 14, it was still young back then, but it wasn't like too young.
Yeah.
And the census of that year, women got married at 20 and a half years old,
Mm-hmm.
and men were 26.
Yeah.
So she was very, very young. It was still so like that argument is just, I've heard that all my life too, or how they, not all my life, I should say, just as long as I've heard about it. But that argument that believing members make that,
It was normal back
it was
then. normal.
normal back then. It was
Yeah.
normal in the West. No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
So let's stop that narrative also. It was not normal.
Yeah.
So
And when they did marry that young, it was a public marriage recognized in the
Mm.
community. She had rights of inheritance and was honored for her position in the community. This is not what was offered to these young girls.
Well, and wasn't it with a husband of a similar age or
Wouldn't matter
around?
if they could show some cases where there were older men. I had a girlfriend that after divorce, she married a guy that was, I don't know, 20, 25 years older than her. And so she was like, I don't know, 30 and he was 55. And they had a good second marriage. I mean, there's quite a few people probably that have that big a age gap.
But
But
I mean,
they're
when
not the norm.
yeah, but I mean, when the woman is a minor,
Yes, a minor brings in another situation.
Right.
And I keep hammering on this. They weren't marriages.
yeah.
These were hidden affairs, labeled marriages.
Jen.
Sorry, my mind's just bouncing all over with this Helen story. But they also said that Heber came to Joseph and offered his daughter to Joseph, but that's not why Heber was going back to Joseph. He was going back to Joseph because of his wife and that talk that was going on because of Heber and his wife. He wasn't going there to offer up his daughter just like out of the blue. Oh, let's go over to Joseph's house and
Yeah.
tell him to marry Helen. No, that was Joseph asked to take their daughter, and they had to
Yeah.
go back in.
From what I know, I was talking with LDS Discussions this morning, and he was telling me that when he studied this, it was hard for him to find somewhere where Joseph was the one asking for Helen. I mean, that doesn't mean that didn't happen. I know Lindsay Hansen Parker, I listened to the episode this morning, and she says that it was Joseph who asked for Helen. So I don't know. I would have to visit it back, like how it, like what documents we have.
What dad wants
Exactly.
to offer his 14-year-old daughter
Exactly.
up to a 36, 37, 38-year-old man?
And then we have the fact
Especially-
that the mom was
Yeah.
super devastated too.
Especially when the mom's like, when my husband came and
Yeah.
asked me that Joseph, wants to marry her,
Mhm.
that I was so devastated and distraught and heartbroken and everything like that. You think that if it was something that they were going to offer their daughter, it would be, they would already had talked about it and they would go to him and that would be like a thing they would do together.
Right.
And it didn't, in her
Yeah.
journal, it doesn't sound like that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It sounds like he came to.
I agree.
Yeah.
All right. Well, so that's a call for anyone who knows anyone who's wealthy, any filmmakers. We want the idea of a biopic on Helen Mar Kimball to have originated here on Mormon Stories Podcast. Help us make it happen. Ex-Mormon, post-Mormon, progressive Mormon gods, let it happen. Okay. We're almost done, believe it or not. Now we're going to get an explanation as to why there was polyandry. You ready? Of course, they're not going to pay close attention. They're not going to actually use the word, but we're going to hear why polyandry is okay. Here we go.
Plural marriage was a lot. We didn't practice sealings then the way that we do now, where you're sealed. Like my husband and I are sealed, and we were married in the temple, and so our children were part of the covenant with us. Or another couple can join the church or get married in the temple after they're married, and then their children are sealed to them. That came much, much later. Right now, in the church. Sealings meant just being part of a family network with people that would help secure your salvation. And so this is why even there are women who were married who were sealed to Joseph Smith while their husbands were alive. And that's the way to make sense of that, is maybe their husband wasn't a member of the church, and getting sealed to a really valiant person, especially the prophet. There are all kinds of people sealing themselves to the prophet, even after his death, sealing themselves as a child, sealing themselves,
Right.
all
They
these
just want
other
to be
things.
connected to him in an ordinance.
They want to be connected to him, and they want to be saved. And they saw being sealed to him as a way to secure their own salvation.
So basically, polyandry wasn't sexual. It was basically just a bunch of people wanting to get sealed to Joseph. Sandra?
Well, why wouldn't these women want to be sealed to their husbands? I
Well,
don't-
she
That's
says
a
that they
good
were not
question.
members. She
That's
says
a
that they
good
were
question.
not
well,
members.
some were members and some
Mhm.
weren't.
Yeah.
I think
but-
most of them had their husbands were members.
Right.
Yeah, and they weren't just on paper. They obviously included regular marriage relationships, because we know that Sylvia Sessions, that had the daughter, that is that gonna
No, it's fine.
Sylvia Sessions had a daughter that she named Josephine. And so in her dying days, did you want me to stop there?
Where is it?
It's in my purse
Okay.
over
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. Jen's going. Keep going. Keep going.
Yeah. Okay. Sylvia Sessions' daughter was named Josephine. And on Sylvia's deathbed out here in the West, she tells Josephine that your dad was really Joseph Smith. Now, the Mormons want to try to make Josephine not Joseph's child. And we know from DNA, evidently, that she wasn't Joseph's child. But the question is, why did Sylvia think it was? I mean, I don't have problems thinking of who the husband man was that authored my kids, so I mean, how could she make this mistake? I mean, I don't sit around thinking, oh no, I wonder if it was Harry down the street, I mean, it just that she would tell her on her deathbed, I named you Josephine because you're Joseph's child, means that she did have sex with Joseph. And it's right in the middle of this period when Brian Hales wants to make this
Mhm.
argument that she was separated from her husband for a while. And so it was okay for her to have a child by Joseph during that period. They were sort of like, she was sort of like divorced, not really, but sort of. And then she went back to her husband, but he tries real hard to keep her from having sexual relations with both men
Right.
at the same time. But the only way you could confuse who the father was is if you had sex with both of them in a very short period of time.
Right. Right.
So the whole story is just really crazy. But they say, well, he didn't have any children. Well, we don't know what the situation with Joseph is on that, but we know he did have intercourse with one Mormon woman who believed the child she had was Joseph's.
Right. Right. If Dan Vogel gives an expose on this whole story, and it's just amazing to see how Brian Hales will do acrobats with the evidence to fit whatever he wants it to fit. Because when everyone before DNA evidence, and when everyone believed that Josephine was actually Joseph's daughter, Brian Hill's whole argument, he was pulling from like really weird sources to prove that she had, what's her name?
Josephine.
No, but
Sylvia.
Yes, that Sylvia had stopped having sexual relations with his her husband, and was only having sexual relations with Joseph. But when the evidence came up that, oh, she's actually not Joseph's daughter, then Brian Hales had to change his whole argument and say like, oh, well, maybe she never had sex with Joseph all along, and maybe she was only talking about Josephine being Joseph's daughter in a spiritual sense. And so it's just ridiculous.
Wait, Gerardo, are you saying that Brian Hales starts with the conclusion and then rearranges the evidence to support the conclusion he's already arrived at? Is that what you're saying?
He's not a trained historian, so
Well, this whole thing is an attempt by Kate Holbrook to justify polyandry, and it's basically saying, in God's wisdom, God needed these women to be, because it's a house of order, their structure. So God needed these women married to other men to be sealed to Joseph. And what I wanted to do was pull a clip from none other than Jeffrey R. Holland, where he's in some fireside somewhere, I think in Latin America, I'm not sure. And they're asking him, wait a minute, what if a woman is sealed to a man, the man dies, and then a subsequent man won't want to be married to the woman because she's already sealed to her first husband, and this other man wants to be sealed to someone. And so there are all these predicaments members are bringing to Jeffrey R. Holland about all these confusing sealing scenarios. And I just think it's really important, and Sandra, you may enjoy this, to hear what Jeffrey Holland says about sealings and their necessity. Are you ready?
Yes.
You ready, Sandra?
I've got to see this.
Okay, here we go. You can watch it on the screen right there.
Well, you know what you do in a case like that? You do what obviously you would do, what you should do. You trust in God's goodness. When there are questions to which we do not know the answer, then you trust in what you do know. And what you do know is that God is good and fair and just and merciful. He is not going to deny those children with their father or that father with his own children. How he works it out, it doesn't matter. It's not your problem. God will figure it out. Look, he has to bring the flowers up every spring. He has to keep the planets in their orbit and the solar system working. If he can do that, he can take care of your family. He can take care of a father and some children. Trust in God and know that these sealing arrangements can all be worked out and that no one's action can block your exaltation. All of this is handled by
Yeah. So what do you think, Sandra?
Well, he kept talking about the father and the children. I don't know where the mother was in the picture, but I thought the whole issue was sealing families together so that you would have your mom and dad and the 5 kids all together. And it doesn't work out with polygamy and especially not with divorces or whatever, because you can't keep all those different family groups together. When you have these different wives, these different husbands, then you have all this mixed children stuff that it's impossible to keep all those families together. I mean, you take in my own family where there was polygamy, each wife has her group of kids sealed to her, yeah, but she doesn't have a full-time husband sealed to her. It doesn't matter how you approach this, it just is a system that isn't going to work out when you make these family groups being different units, because you got to split up parents somehow to get it all to work.
And my question is, if God's fair and just and is going to make it all work in the end, why does he need Joseph Smith to be sealed to these women who are sealed to other men? Why couldn't God have just said, you know what, Joseph, you've got plenty. Women, you've already got husbands. If Joseph needs something in the afterlife, we'll work that out later. Why were the women at that point compelled to be married to Joseph when God can work it out in the afterlife and just be fair then? Does that make sense?
Well, it's just like with polygamy. I mean, everyone's going to have everything work out later. I don't know how this all can work out with any logical thought because they make it so literal.
Yeah. But that's when they always say, well, trust in your faith, trust in faith, because it doesn't make sense, but trust in your feelings, trust in faith. All right. So we're almost done. We're going back to a little more Helen. Sorry, Jen, we've got a little more Helen to go.
So that is what Helen's father was trying to achieve for their family. Helen then did have a choice about whether to enter this marriage, and it was something that she prayed about. But unlike some other women who entered plural marriages, she said she did not she had no angel appear. She did not have a large, brilliant revelation. She said she decided to enter this marriage because of logic, because it made sense to her, for the things we were talking about, her own salvation and the salvation of her family. And her records say that it was difficult, but she felt that she made the right choice in it also. And I know when I was 14, I would have been influenced. I don't want to whitewash this. I would have been influenced what my bishop, let alone my prophet, wanted me to do, and what my parents wanted me to do. But it's important to me still to honor the decision that she made. Joseph Smith was also 14 when he had the first vision. It's important to me to honor the agency that she did have, the decision she made, and particularly her legacy of staying not just true to the church, but really continuing to build Zion throughout her life. Jen,
What do you want to say about Helen? I mean, the argument basically is that, she consented. She was 14, but she had a choice, and we should honor her choice.
She didn't have a choice, and I think we've
We beat this to
made
death, yeah.
we've beat this.
Yeah.
She didn't want it. We have from
Yeah.
her own words and her own hand. And for them to compare Helen to, at 14, being put into a polygamous relationship with Joseph, to him at 14 getting a vision, like from a prayer, that's not comparable. That's not comparable.
What's extra disturbing is it's a woman making this argument. I don't mean to be rude, but it's a woman, and it's awful if a man makes it too, but it just seems extra awful that a woman somehow is making this argument.
Yeah. I don't understand. Maybe she can call me and let me know like what her, like how she as a woman could come to this conclusion after reading that journal, because me as a woman and a mother, and just reading that crushes me. And there's no way I would be like, oh, and she consented and she said it was okay. And, it was okay. Just like when Joseph was 14 and had a vision, it's not, no.
I mean, flip it around. Let's say Kate Holbrook has a daughter who's 14, who's meeting alone with the bishop in his office. And the bishop is able to convince the 14-year-old daughter that God wants him to marry the daughter. So they have sex there in the bishop's office, which, by the way, has happened, right? And the daughter walks away thinking, no, wait, he loves me, and he's a man of God, and God told him that we're supposed to be together, so trust the child. Would Kate Holbrook go, oh, well, the 14-year-old came out of the bishop's office saying that God inspired her, or it was a logical decision to make, and the bishop was her leader, so is she going to trust her 14-year-old child and say, that's good, bishop, good job, 14-year-old daughter, you did the right thing?
Yeah, no, she's not going to trust that. And it's not okay. And but Helen, even in that kind of comparison, Helen didn't come out of the bishop's office saying, oh, it's great, and he loves me, and I'm happy. After she was sealed and married to Joseph, she's still saying, I want to go to the dance. I want to go to the dance. I want to have this love that all the other 14-year-old girls, get to have. I feel, she even says, I feel abused. Where is that? I'm going to pull that up so I don't misquote it. I long for the freedom that was denied me and thought myself a much abused child. Those are her words. Those are her words. Like, no,
Yeah.
not okay.
Yeah.
We have sort of a parallel case with George P. Lee, the Navajo General Authority that was excommunicated a number of years ago. He approached a couple of teenage girls in his ward about polygamy, and he got excommunicated. They didn't think it was okay in today's world.
Yeah. Well, the truth is there's a couple things that are true. Number one is we've gone 3.5 hours. Number two is that we have several more slides. But what's also just incredibly strange is that they only get through verse 40 of DNC 132.
And how many verses?
And there are a total of 66. So they basically have left off like another 26 verses. And by the way, Sandra, what did you say about those remaining 26 verses?
Well, they're all about Emma. Isn't it convenient that their program ends right when it gets to the part about all the commandments to Emma on how she has to live this polygamy
or is going to be destroyed.
or be destroyed?
But the revelation had nothing to do with Emma.
Oh, well, no, other than the fact that Joseph asked God about it. How do you justify my servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in having polygamy? You know, that was the whole thing was about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we've decided is we're going to have a third episode. So like once we hit 3 hours and 40 minutes, it's late. We are going to have a third episode. And the third episode is going to finish these final slides.
Yeah.
Have we talked enough about Helen Mar Kimball today, Jen? What do you think?
I don't know. I don't know if you can ever talk enough about her because people need to
Yeah.
know and learn about her.
She's like
But-
the silver bullet. Maybe she
Yeah.
is the silver bullet. Maybe it's not Book of Abraham. Maybe it's not horses.
Hmm.
Maybe Helen Mar Kimball is the smoking gun.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, she was.
There's so many.
So thank you,
smoking guns.
Helen. Thank you, Helen.
Yes.
You said there's so many smoking guns.
Yeah. To me, I think it was more the Zina story was more disturbing to me. First, I don't know why, but I think one of the reasons why the main apologetic argument about polyandry was that Joseph didn't understand really how to live it. He was trying to get out of it, so he tried to marry women that were already married, so he didn't have to have sex with them. But then really looking at what Zina tells us about how it actually played out, like that argument doesn't hold up.
Yeah. So Sandra, will you come back for a third episode?
If I live through this one, yes.
All right. Well, we've had like almost 700 continual viewers throughout this episode. It's been very popular. Sandra, you're a legend. We love you. We appreciate you. We honor and respect you. And all of our viewers and listeners are saying, Sandra, hooray, Sandra's back.
Yes.
So thank you, Sandra, for coming.
Okay. Thank you.
Gerardo, thank you for arranging this. And you set up all these clips so that we could easily watch them. So Gerardo, you're the one that got Sandra to come and scheduled it all. So Gerardo, thank you again for all you do for Mormon Stories.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jen, it's so happy to have you on the Open Stories Foundation team. And thanks for running the sound and the lights and the cameras today and making all this possible.
You're so
And-
welcome.
And for your heartfelt analysis
Yes.
and perspective.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're a natural. This is only like your second episode, right?
Yeah, I think I did Kara got sick one day and I filled in for a couple hours. So thanks for being so nice to me today, everyone.
Yeah. So it's good.
I think we need more Jen. More Jen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And Kara, we wish you a good, happy vacation. And we are excited to have you back as co-host for episodes in the future, along with lots of other co-hosts, including Gerardo and Nemo and Jen and others. So anyway, great episode, everyone. Thank you so much. Thanks for your support. Really quickly, we have a Discord channel. A Discord channel is where you can go text and talk. Even after this episode's over, the conversation continues on Discord. So please go to mormonstories.org. Up in the top left, you'll see the social media buttons. You can click on the Discord channel, join it, and continue the conversation there, and join an amazing community of Mormon Stories listeners. Mormonism Live, Radio Free Mormon, and Bill Real Fans. They're all kind of working there. Maven has been in the chats. Maven, we salute you. You're helping Mormonism Live out. Thank you so much. Sandra, you own a bookstore. Do you want to tell people how to support you and your bookstore?
Well, that's a good question because I'm getting closer to retirement. But yes, we still have the bookstore open and we have a website at utlm.org and a book list is on there. You can order online and we just got all more information than you want to read. So a lot of free stuff. You can read our newsletters forever.
Yeah, and we are paying Sandra to do these episodes, and so we would love it. Number one, if you could support Sandra, go to utlm.org,
Yeah.
buy her books, or you can donate to her organization.
Yeah.
And also, we would love it if you could go. There's a fundraiser button here in YouTube that you can click on and donate to this episode, or you can go to mormonstories.org, click on the donate button. Please support Sandra. Please support her work. We want to pay our participants. We want to pay our women, and we need your support to do that. And we need to pay Gerardo and Jen and this whole operation. So please become a monthly donor at mormonstories.org. We need your support, and we've had a great year, and we would love you to join the host of people that are making all this amazing work possible. We did 17 million downloads and views in 2021. And
Wow.
it's because of your support. And we're bigger than the Salt Lake Tribune now. We're big. And we'll just get bigger with your support. Thanks to all our viewers and listeners. Email us at mormonstories@gmail.com with feedback. Give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. People who don't even listen to the podcast, who don't like the podcast, are giving us bad reviews. We need your positive reviews to fix that. Please, especially on Apple Podcasts. You can give us a positive review at Mormon Stories Podcast Facebook page, and share this episode with everyone, friends, family, wherever it's safe. Share it, and then subscribe at TikTok, Mormon Stories Podcast, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, wherever you can. Follow us, and that helps with the algorithm. Is there anything I forgot, Gerardo?
No, you got it all.
Jen?
Sounds great.
All right. Sandra,
Yeah.
you good?
I think I'm going to make it home. Yeah.
All right. All right. Thanks again, Sandra. Thanks to all our
Okay.
listeners and viewers. We'll see you guys all again soon on another episode of Mormon Stories Podcast. Take care, everybody.